Greetings, Wastelanders. This is a compilation of over 2 hours and 25 minutes of Fallout lore explained. Sit back, relax, and grab your sugar bombs. Let's kick things off with the every pre-apocalypse war. In Fallout Explained, the Great War lasted just 2 hours, 120 minutes, enough to destroy cities, bring down societies, and erase entire swathes of history. But the truth is that the world as we know it wasn't swept away in 2 hours, under the devastation of bombs. It began to slowly crumble many years earlier, and the Great War was only the final act, the last straw that broke the camel's back. There was a period, 25 years long, in which the entire world shattered piece by piece, when every single step we took led us toward total destruction, a long era of bitter conflicts that preceded the day of the apocalypse. What were later called the Resource Wars, invasion of Mexico. It was the mid-21st century when all the major world powers were faced with a reality they had stubbornly ignored for years. Global oil reserves were dangerously depleted, and there were still no viable alternatives to replace them. Every country knew it was racing against time, and every barrel of oil consumed was a step closer to societal collapse. No oil meant no transportation, no energy, and no industrial production. The United States was probably the first to experience the thrill of this looming danger. In 2050, Americans saw all the oil fields on Texan soil depleted, one after another, suddenly deprived of one of the nation's greatest resources. Fortunately, there were still thriving reserves in the Alaska region, but they were nowhere near enough to meet the needs of an ever-growing nation. Forced to look around for a supplier, they turned to their southern neighbor, Mexico, which still possessed many fully functioning deposits. However, the scarcity of global resources had caused the value of black gold to skyrocket to unprecedented heights, and when the Mexicans proposed their price, the United States became furious, accusing them of exploiting their dire straits to rob them. Unable to negotiate a favorable offer, the United States soon reached a conclusion as pragmatic as it was chilling. If the Mexicans didn't want to sell them oil at a favorable price, then there was no other option than to seize their deposits, whatever the cost. In reality, the American strategy was very intelligent, if ruthless. In response to the failure of negotiations, they imposed extremely high tariffs on Mexico, which imported numerous essential goods from its northern neighbors. The inability to obtain the same supplies elsewhere soon led the nation's economy to deteriorate under the weight of rising prices and the scarcity of products. Mexico lacked the social stability of the United States, and the collective unrest soon erupted into numerous protests and violent riots against government agencies. It was at that point that the United States made its move, the one it had planned from the beginning. Citing the escalation of violence spreading throughout its neighboring country as an excuse, it began sending large numbers of troops under the pretext of protecting its own borders. Gradually, those same forces began to set foot on foreign soil under the pretext of helping the Mexican state quell the ever-increasing revolts and, above all, securing its precious oil reserves. From that point on, it didn't take long for the United States to gradually gain military control of all areas of interest for the oil fields, completely cutting off the Mexican administration. Weakened by citizen protests and the massive tariffs that were crippling its economy, the Mexican government realized it was too weak to stand up to the U.S. military. Thus, by 2051, the U.S. military had taken control not only of the nation's precious oil fields, but also of all major infrastructure, effectively turning Mexico into a new colony completely subject to its influence. Checkmate, the Euro-Middle East War. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the political and economic landscape is changing profoundly, and behind the scenes, there are those who silently observe, arranging their pieces and waiting to make the first move. Since its founding, the European Commonwealth has become a global superpower, high levels of industrialization, a massive army, and a robust economy, but it is also extremely dependent on imports and has insufficient internal resources to sustain its energy demands. Thus, when the taps of its old trading partners begin to turn off, Europe finds itself more vulnerable than it ever imagined. A government incapable of guaranteeing energy loses one of the pillars of its legitimacy. The result is protests, strikes, rationing, and a market in panic. But all is not lost. The Commonwealth government has watched the Mexican occupation campaign with attention and interest, and the message sent by the United States has been perfectly understood. The rules have changed. If resources are lacking, just take them elsewhere by force. Thus, the eyes of all Europe turned eastward, to the Middle East, and its still rich oil reserves. Up until that point, the Middle Eastern states had been playing a dangerous game of bidding war. Like Mexico, they had taken advantage of the delicate global situation to impose a radical increase in the price of oil per barrel. But unlike their counterparts, They boasted a rich economy capable of financing massive military forces. And so, until then, they had resisted the political and economic assaults of national forces interested in its resources. However, Europe had no intention of waging a false campaign like the US. Having deployed its forces along the border, their intentions were clear. No more negotiations. Hand over control of the oil fields to us, or we will take them by force. Thus began the war. But it was a very different one from those the forces in the field had experienced in the past. It was not a quick conflict with limited objectives. The European government was likely hoping for an extremely quick war, just long enough to occupy the oil reserves, perhaps without encountering too much resistance from the smaller Middle Eastern state. But that wasn't the case. The opposing coalition proved extremely resilient, and not a single piece of land was ceded without massive losses on both sides. The United Nations attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution, but in response, many member states, facing dire straits due to the shortage of oil reserves, decided to abandon the organization, which effectively ceased to exist within just 3 months. Meanwhile, the lightning conflict had transformed into a full-blown war of attrition. In 2053, Tel Aviv was reduced to rubble by a nuclear terrorist attack of unclear origin. This led both sides to accuse each other, initiating an exchange of attacks with low-yield nuclear warheads that only increased the number of casualties. It was at this stage of the conflict that both powers saw a clear pattern unfolding before their eyes. Neither side has any intention of giving up. Neither wants to be the first to fall. The first to find enough reasons not to continue will lose. And with this in mind, a terrible strategy is implemented first by the Middle Eastern forces and then by Europe itself. It's no longer a matter of grabbing the few remaining resources. Both sides know that whoever retreats will face the inevitable collapse of their society, and neither has any intention of being the first to fall. Thus, the first sabotages begin. The reasoning is better to destroy than to leave in enemy hands. In the final months of the war, the European Commonwealth is falling apart, with the smaller nations beginning to crumble under the weight of the war effort and the total lack of raw materials to support their economies. The Middle Eastern coalition has become a sieve, a devastated zone under constant military control. Oil fields are being blown up like firecrackers by bombings from both armies, and the damage is incalculable. By 2060, Europe is on the brink of collapse. Many internal governments have fallen, and the European Commonwealth is virtually non-existent. The Middle East has become a bombed-out wasteland, and the oil fields that sparked the conflict have been destroyed or exhausted, exploited to the last drop to prosecute the conflict. Between 2060 and 2077, there are scant references to functionally intact bits and pieces of British and European cities and states, as well as the post-war period. But while people may desire for an official version of Fallout London, it's unlikely that how the mod depicts it and how the world of Fallout describes it will ever truly coincide. The war is finally over, but there is no winner. Alaska under attack. By 2066, the world had already entered the most chaotic and destructive era in its history, and no one was exempt from the disastrous effects of war. China was the second superpower on the global stage after the fall of the European Commonwealth, but like Europe and the United States, despite, or perhaps because of, its size, it was no longer able to supply its population with oil and many other essential resources. The People's Republic of China had always been a solid power, largely thanks to its vast territory, which had allowed it access to a vast quantity of minerals and resources, including coal, which for decades had been the nation's energy pillar. However, just as had happened with oil, these mines had also been exhausted under intense extraction, and now China found itself deprived of all its major sources of livelihood. Until that point, America itself had been an excellent trading partner, but the old agreements had become meaningless. After consolidating its presence on Mexican soil, the United States found itself facing two new crises. The first was a mysterious, extremely viral and deadly disease that began to spread throughout the nation, the New Plague, which propaganda portrayed as an attack by some foreign force intended to destabilize American society. While the New Plague's impact on American society faded away to almost nothing, it still generated immense panic, not unlike a certain real-world situation a few years ago. The second was the brutal war between Europe and the Middle East, which it was feared would spread to overseas nations. It was in this tense climate that the government's highest echelons initiated a series of strategies aimed at maintaining internal stability, launching two projects that would profoundly shape the world of Fallout: the development of the forced evolutionary virus to counter Chinese bioweapons, as well as the New Plague, and the launch of the Safe House Project, which would lead to the construction of vaults throughout the country. In line with its new isolationist policy, the United States decided it was crucial to strengthen its defenses in Alaska, currently the most valuable oil reserve available. After all, they had seen how easily another superpower had seized on its campaign to occupy Mexico and would not allow anyone else to turn its own strategy against them. However, to reach Alaska, it was necessary to cross Canadian soil, and the government of the nation to the north did not look favorably on the entry of large foreign military forces within its borders. Relations with the United United States had always been excellent, but what had happened in Mexico was a clear warning bell that had significantly shaken trust in its old ally. So America did what it did best. It threatened massive sanctions in the form of trade tariffs. After all, they had the perfect excuse. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline ran through Canada, allowing oil supplies to reach American soil. It was simply the right and duty of the United States to send military forces to protect the viaduct to prevent sabotage and tampering by opposing factions. After all, the Canadians also received supplies from that same structure. It was a necessary action in the common interest. Unable to resist the political pressure, the Canadian government finally relented, agreeing to the entry of a limited number of military forces. But this was only the first step, and it was now clear that America would no longer have any qualms about disposing of its neighbors as it saw fit if the situation required it. Having blocked most imports to concentrate the resources on domestic needs, America began to focus its attention on the development of new energy and military technologies, even developing the first prototypes of portable fusion cells for civilian use. In just a few years, the United States had become a true energy fortress, perfectly capable of surviving the pressing global crisis. But every fortress inevitably creates an external enemy, and wealth often attracts unwanted attention. China, cut off from oil supplies and feeling threatened by America's new drive for scientific development, decided that the only way to avoid a slow internal collapse was immediate military intervention. Despite American preparations, in December 2066, the Chinese army successfully landed on the coast of Alaska and quickly occupied vast swathes of territory, even reaching Anchorage, the state capital, a strategically vital point for controlling the oil fields. The U.S. Army was well positioned, but it was powerless against the ferocity and sheer size of its forces deployed by China. Canada itself thwarted American defense efforts. Still smarting from the experience with the Trans-Siberian Viaduct, it initially refused to allow the reinforcements needed to counter the Chinese advance to pass through its territory. This decision forced the United States to break the blockade and allow its forces to pass through foreign soil to advance towards Alaska. This move sparked the first demonstrations of discontent among the Canadian civilian population. In any case, the new reinforcements immediately proved effective, especially thanks to the use of one of the brand new superweapons developed by West Tech, the T-45 power armor. These fusion-powered warsuits turned the soldiers who wore them into veritable machines of destruction. Despite some mobility issues, the steel plates they were made of made them as durable as tanks. Furthermore, thanks to a highly advanced hydraulic press system, they allowed soldiers to lift and deploy extremely heavy weapons such as miniguns and rocket launchers with extreme ease, giving them enough destructive power to single-handedly annihilate entire enemy squads. But China did not sit idly by, and had no intention of being pushed back into the sea after all its efforts to grab the new territories. After the initial shocking impact, Chinese intelligence began an extremely rapid race to develop weapons capable of countering American dominance. There was even talk of creating its own version of power armor for direct use on the Alaskan front, but development was not completed in mass quantities, only in limited amounts. However, other projects did emerge, such as the implementation of lightweight and versatile anti-tank weapons, perfect for countering the robustness of American power armor. Additionally, the Chinese trained child spies and soldiers for infiltration into America by brainwashing and torturing them, infiltrating areas such as West Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Boston. Though efforts to sabotage Hoover Dam in Nevada were quickly met with the death of all Chinese insurgents involved, thankfully, the Chinese had also developed extraordinary stealth technology to counteract American robotics and energy weaponry development. The Chinese response was so effective that within a very short time, a clear situation emerged for both sides. They were at a stalemate. On the one hand, China was acquiring enough resources to postpone the collapse of its economy for the time being. On the other, the United States was relentlessly trying to gain ground and reclaim its lost deposits, but without success. The only notable result was the massive loss of life on both sides. The annexation of Canada. Despite recent invasive actions by the US military, America and Canada are still allies, or at least on paper. However, the cumbersome armed presence of their southern cousins is increasingly restricting the Canadian people. The seeds of discord have already been planted, and it won't be long before they begin to bear fruit. Soon, the first demonstrations aimed at expressing popular dissent over the fragility of their government's choices and the desire to expel the foreign army from their borders. But at the time, no one could imagine that this was only the beginning of something darker. The situation exploded in 2072. Having managed to bypass the strict US military controls, some dissidents attempted to sabotage the Trans Pipeline. The precise affiliation of this group is unknown. They were likely Canadian protesters intent on demonstrating against the occupying power. But there was even talk of Chinese infiltrators attempting to cut off the United States from Alaskan oil supplies. In any case, rather Rather than being detrimental to the Americans, this maneuver proved to be the perfect opportunity. The pretext was unassailable. Following the clear attack on the viaduct's security and the Canadian government's inability to prevent similar attacks, the United States had no choice but to send in new military forces to ensure the protection of its resources and the safety of the Canadian people. On that occasion, the words of General Buzz Babcock, commander of U.S. forces in Canada, became historic. Effectively, immediately, United States troops are beginning a complete takeover of all Canadian assets and resources. Little America is ours, but let's face it, it always has been. That was the first time the term was used to refer to the Canadian nation. And from that point on, its slow dissolution began. In reality, Canada's annexation wasn't a real war, but a slow assimilation as insidious as it was total. By then, the presence of U.S. military forces on Canadian soil had stripped the nation's government of most of the strategic areas for territorial control. As protests subsided under military pressure, Washington even decided to begin exploiting Canada's enormous natural resources, arguing that given the enormous economic and military cost incurred by the U.S. to protect Canada from the Chinese invader, it must contribute somehow to the war effort. In this way, the United States secured access not only to mineral and oil residues, but also to timber reserves useful for building structures and fortifications, rare earths, uranium, and above all, direct logistical access to the East Pacific. Not to mention all the top-secret military and scientific projects that Canada was secretly working on, such as the production of highly advanced robots to be used for civilian security and to support military forces on the battlefield. Piece by piece, Canada was stripped of its sovereignty. Former decommissioned military bases were converted into U.S. command centers, many government buildings were dismantled, and martial law was even declared in areas deemed high risk. As the war with China continued with no end in sight, the United States decided to exploit the media narrative to transform the conflict into a propaganda tool. From this perspective, the annexation was gradually presented as a liberation. The U.S. media began to broadcast images of the brave American soldiers protecting the Canadian population. Cartoons, comics, and entire advertising campaigns were produced to portray what was effectively a genuine occupation as an act of generosity and brotherhood towards their northern cousins and allies. The American military had become the true heroes, while the Canadian partisan resistance was demonized as extremists and enemies of order. But the truth was quite different. Canadian society was oppressed by U.S. forces. The protests were bloodily crushed, and rioters were arrested or even executed on the spot. Entire communities were crushed under the weight of the soldiers' brutality. Meanwhile, the American machine was also moving legally, officially declaring the occupied Canadian provinces unincorporated U.S. territories. A pompous way of saying that those territories would never join the Union, but would instead be governed directly by Washington under military administrators who would maintain martial law. Canada was no longer an independent state, but a nation within a larger and stronger nation. A true little America, the liberation of Alaska. But let's return to the war front. In 2074, the two forces were in perfect balance. Neither was able to drive the other from Alaska, but China undoubtedly had the upper hand. Having occupied the oil fields, it was extracting black gold at a relentless pace, and then shipping it back to the motherland. The Americans, on the other hand, saw their precious resources being stolen from under their noses, unable to deliver the final blow to drive out the invader. Furthermore, China was not only devoting its forces to the war effort, numerous spies were secretly infiltrating American society, attempting to seize control of strategic positions of power and trying to bring down the United States from within. Numerous attacks and conspiracies were foiled, but just as many were successful. Chinese agents were spreading discontent among the population, which already resented their nation's violent actions against former allies, and the excuse of the ongoing war no longer seemed a valid justification. The highest levels of the U.S. government were well aware that drastic action was needed, something that would change the course of the war. The reasoning was simple. The Chinese are not just invading us, they are also endangering our very internal stability. It's time to repay them with the same medicine. Armed with the new material and human resources obtained from the annexation of Canada, the U.S. military carried out an operation aimed at dividing the Chinese forces and bringing the war directly to their homeland. Thus, a large fleet of ships was sent overseas with the task of occupying Chinese soil and blocking the passage of supplies from Alaska. The strategy was partially effective. China found itself fighting on two fronts, forced to choose between preserving its newly conquered oil fields and defending its territory from the relentless advance of American forces. In such a heated war, both sides began to play their most powerful and dangerous cards in an attempt to land the winning blow that would change the course of the conflict. China focused on biochemical weapons, attempting to develop viruses that would annihilate the enemy army. America, on the other hand, deployed genetic oddities, monsters created in laboratories with the specific intent of annihilating every enemy force on the battlefield. This is how the Death Claws, the forced evolutionary virus, and many other aberrations that would later spread across the post-apocalyptic post-apocalyptic world first appeared. There was even an attempt to deploy the infamous and feared Liberty Prime, an iron giant with the destructive power of a warship, but the project was not completed in time. The turning point finally came in 2076 with the introduction of the new T-51 power armor. Thanks to this new model, much more durable and agile than its predecessors, American soldiers now possessed not only enormous firepower, but also the ability to attack and reposition quickly, thus evading enemy return fire. Pressure from this new military might, Chinese forces had no choice but to retreat, losing ground day after day, until in early 2077, Anchorage was officially liberated from foreign control, thus ending the Chinese occupation of Alaska. Towards the end, it could have been the end. The enemy defeated, the oil fields recovered, the military stronger than ever before. The United States could have stopped there, retreat once more, as it had in the past, and this time with all the credentials to advance its society without having to worry about the resource crisis. But when you achieve something, it's easy to start craving more. The US government had seen a new political horizon and new heights of power to conquer, and it would not step aside before achieving them. Instead of withdrawing its troops from Chinese territory, it continued its campaign of conquest. Many of the soldiers who had been deployed in the war to reconquer Alaska, and who had been promised a glorious return home once the operation was completed, instead found themselves deployed overseas on the new front in mainland China. The Chinese army, now in retreat, had no choice but to withdraw its lines, allowing the Americans to occupy large swaths of their immense nation, reaching as far as the Gobi Desert and the banks of the Yangtze River. However, this move sparked discontent among the American population. Protests against the current US government's unscrupulous, almost tyrannical behavior had never subsided. The war was clearly over, and Americans were tired of this endless struggle. Their only desire was to see their children return home and resume the peaceful, safe life they had always known. Clearly, this consensus was unacceptable to the government forces, who had no intention of settling for what they had achieved thus far. Now deprived of the main narrative weapons that had previously fueled the propaganda machine and kept general discontent at bay, the government attempted to direct public attention to a new critical target, a treacherous and invisible enemy, yet one so fearsome as to justify extreme action. Paranoia was the weapon they decided to adopt. They tried to convince the population that the war wasn't truly over, but had infiltrated their homes, their neighborhoods, and even the people they knew best: Chinese spies, insurgents from Canada, terrorists from Mexico. The new enemy wasn't armed with a rifle and bulletproof vest, but his weapon was his words, and his goal was to incite revolts against the established order. Having sown doubt among its citizens, the government launched a series of cruel strategies to stem the problem they themselves had created. Actual labor camps were created, where all those suspected of conspiring against the United States were locked up. They were supposed to be prisons for spies and terrorists, but the truth is that they quickly became confined to protesters, rioters, and any other individual who opposed the new policies. Many citizens of Chinese origin were brought there under the pretext of being infiltrators, but the truth was that doubt and paranoia were so widespread that simply having the same physical features as the enemy was easily blamed. There were numerous protests and demonstrations to oppose these inhumane conditions, but the government had no qualms about violently suppressing them, as it had done in Mexico and Canada. Soldiers returning from the war in Alaska were even sent in their power armor to pacify the dissidents, but many of them resolved to rebel against their own commanders. After the exhausting operation to recover the oil deposits and the endless war on Chinese soil, they had no intention of returning home to fight against the very citizens they had sworn to protect. The situation soon escalated nationwide. Discontent with the Army's performance was compounded by protests over the lack of jobs. As new technologies brought automation to industries, tens of thousands lost their jobs. The first riots broke out over the lack of basic necessities and the poverty rate, which had reached unprecedented levels. One by one, the squads sent to contain the unrest joined forces with the protesters themselves, forcing the government to declare a very strict martial law in an attempt to regain control of the nation. But without them realizing it, the United States was now racing frantically toward the abyss, and the slightest thing would have been enough to undo the efforts of all those years of conflict. When it became clear that the situation had reached a critical point, pressured from all sides by widespread dissent and by resistance groups entrenched within the annexed nations, the government's top officials, including the president himself, decided to implement their final defensive solution, abandoning their government posts and moving to a highly equipped oil platform equipped with the most modern and advanced defense systems. From this position, they would not only be able to monitor the situation on US soil from a secure and unassailable location, but would also have full control of the oil rig with all the energy reserves they would ever need. This was the birth of what would later be called the Enclave. This move also had a very specific meaning. The president had abandoned the nation. The highest government positions had disappeared, leaving enormous gaps in the chain of command. The edge of the abyss had been reached, yet it would not be necessary to take any further steps. Just as what was once the United States of America was heading heading for collapse, destruction would reach them first. It was October 23, 2077. It's unclear exactly who pressed the button first, but suddenly, all the world's major nations decided to implement their own final standstill. It was 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time when the American Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System identified the first missiles launched by Chinese forces. From his impregnable bunker, far from the impending disaster, the president issued his counterattack order. By the time the first American missiles were launched, bombs had already begun falling on Pennsylvania. Within 2 hours, the United States was reduced to a pile of radiation-contaminated rubble, and so was the rest of the world. The resource war was officially over. The Great War had begun and ended in just 120 minutes. What remained was only the rotten root of human overreach, a wound that 200 years later would still not be healed. Europe versus the Middle East, America versus Canada, America versus Mexico, America versus China. Every conflict at the time had seemed so important, so necessary for its own survival. So how was it possible to reach total self-annihilation? The resource war was nothing more than the result of a world that had stopped believing in cooperation, that had decided to look only at its own backyard, forgetting that everything is connected, nothing happens in a vacuum, and that every destructive action leads to escalations that affect us all. The truth is that the bombs only accelerated the process, but the world of Fallout had been crumbling under the weight of its own hatred for decades. Because when humanity stops thinking about its surroundings and focuses only on its own survival, it stops thinking about tomorrow. And without a tomorrow, nothing remains but ashes. This has been every pre-apocalypse war in Fallout Explained. If you've ever wondered why Fallout's world feels like it was one bad headline away from collapsing even before the bombs, I have good news. It was. Pre-war America and Fallout is not just retro future, but with lasers. It is a country where corporations were so embedded into government, military, medicine, food, and basic survival that the line between business decision and crime against humanity basically stopped existing. The funniest part is that these scandals are not hidden in some obscure lore basement. You trip over them. You read one terminal. You pick up one memo. Suddenly, you realize the apocalypse did not start with nukes. The nukes were just the closing argument, much like accidentally vaporizing a reporter and trying to clean it up like it was spilled coffee. ArcJet Systems. Mars shot failure. ArcJet Systems is one of those companies that looks cool at first glance. Aerospace, contracting, communications, propulsion, big projects, big government contracts. The kind of company that can point at the sky and say, we built that. But by February 2075, ArcJet was financially struggling, and their CEO Thomas Reinhardt decides that the solution is not stabilize, downsize, survive. The solution is bet the entire company on the biggest possible contract. He starts building the propulsion system for the United States Space Administration Mars Shot project. Before ArcJet has even secured the contract, he gambles first and asks permission later. That is the first scandal right there. Not because ambition is evil, but because this is how companies turn engineering into a hostage situation. Once you have sunk time and money into a project, the government becomes the villain if they do not fund you, and you become the hero for trying. That is the trick. And it works. In August 2075, Reinhardt convinces the U.S. Space Administration to award ArcJet the contract, promising completion by July 2077, a full year before the planned launch. He hires Dr. Rory McClellan to lead the project, and then the reality hits. In March 2076, the booster is a few hundred tons over the weight guideline set by the agency, setting the project back. Then the Mars Shot project goes public in July 2076, and the public relations campaign begins, and ArcJet is forced into the most predictable corporate behavior imaginable. Reinhardt lies to the press about the booster's progress. This is the scandal Fallout does best. Not a comic book supervillain, just a man who has tied his company's survival to a deadline and now has to feed the public something other than the truth. Now comes the part that makes me laugh in the darkest possible way. An R&D scientist proposes switching from uranium to deuterium, claiming a better burn-to-thrust ratio. Dr. McClellan likes the proposal, and the company refuses because it would take 3 extra months and cost millions. That right there is the whole Fallout pre-war economy in one moment. We could make it better, but the spreadsheet says no. The spreadsheet is always the final boss. The next beat is where ArcJet stops being corporate lies and becomes criminal cover-up. In February 2077, ArcJet was preparing a photo opportunity for the booster engine. A photographer makes it pass security during a test fire. The test fire vaporizes the reporter, and the means of how it happened is rather telling about what happens next. Reinhardt has the death covered up because he fears the the US Space Administration will cancel the contract, and ArcJet will go bankrupt. An ArcJet corporate memo adds that Reinhardt has his head of security, Sam Brent, take care of the remains, and the incident is quickly covered up because no one actually saw the accident. That is one of the coldest lines in Fallout lore because it is so casual. Take care of the remains. Like this is a routine. Like the company has done this before, and if you want to understand why Fallout corporations feel uniquely evil, it is because they are evil in a way that feels familiar. Nobody in that moment is twirling a mustache. They are doing damage control. They are protecting the brand. They are protecting the contract. And a human being becomes a mess that needs to be cleaned up, literally. I am not even being poetic. That is what happened. Imagine being the security guy whose job is delicate situations at ArcJet. Your resume is just one bullet point that says handled remains. Nobody is giving you a resume endorsement for that. Now here is where the scandal gets bigger than ArcJet, because ArcJet is not operating in a vacuum. ArcJet is a contractor for the United States Space Administration, the government agency responsible for administering the nation's space programs, the USSA. Space scandals. The US Space Administration is not just NASA, but Fallout. Their own history is full of the kind of political pressure and mission drift that turns exploration into propaganda and then into weaponization. Their background includes the space race, disputed claims, and disasters. Captain Carl Bell is credited as the first human in space on Defiant 7, but that claim is disputed by the Soviet Union and China, and Bell dies when the capsule crashes on its return. That is already a scandal shaped like a coffin. We did it first. Did you? Well, either way the guy died. And who could forget the case of Colonel Hartigan? Sent up in the 1960s as an Air Force spaceman, ends up getting kidnapped by the Zeton race in their enigmatic mothership Zeta, tortured, frozen, and then died while frozen. Certainly a worse fate than what the spouse of the sole survivor experiences. But back on Earth, the USSA claimed the craft crash-landed after becoming entangled in high-altitude weather balloons. What a way to be memorialized. You meet alien life, get killed by it, and you're remembered for dying to some balloons. Then you get the Delta IX rocket, commissioned in 2020, described as one of the most successful rockets with over 77 successful launches. It can hold 2 astronauts for up to 24 days. It is used for missions like a 17-day moon mission. And then, after being the last manned rockets to the moon, it is converted for military use by removing the crew and instrument sections so it can carry a nuclear warhead. If you want one sentence that sums up Fallout's America, it is, we built a ship to go to the moon and then turned it into a bomb. That is not even metaphor. That is the literal arc. But that's not all, because the Mars Shot project is where the US Space Administration and ArcJet fuse into one shared scandal. In the 2070s, the US Space Administration plans the Mars Shot project, aiming for a manned mission to Mars by July 2078. They contract ArcJet to produce the XMB booster engine and the deep range transmitter. In early 2076, they had weight problems with the engine. By September 2077, rising political tensions made the agency nervous, and they estimated the project may be delayed for a year or more. So imagine the situation. You have a national space project being sold to the public as a symbol of American greatness, and behind the scenes it is being throttled by war nerves, international unrest, and a contractor who is willing to erase a dead reporter to keep the contract alive. That is not space exploration. That is a PR machine strapped to a rocket, and the US Space Administration does not stop there. Their known projects include Deep Sleep, which launches in 2070 and aims to test the viability of hibernation pods in outer space. That sounds innocent until you notice how Fallout always pairs innocent framing with questionable partners. A government contract with Arctos Pharma is accepted to develop Project Z, a serum derivation of Formula K modified for zero-G efficiency in human subjects. If you are hearing serum derivation and human subjects, and you are not feeling a little sick, I am begging you to remember what franchise you are watching. The space agency is quietly drifting into biochemistry contracts with a pharmaceutical megacorp. This is how scandals become normal. Nobody wakes up and says, today I will become evil. They just keep taking the next contract. Fallout's US Space Administration is basically like, we have 3 goals. 1, go to the moon. 2, go to Mars. 3, if Mars does not work out, please enjoy our nuclear warhead delivery system. Now, the last thing I will say before we pivot is that ArcJet and the US Space Administration scandal is not just a rocket project went wrong, it is a story about what happens when a society is so obsessed with looking strong that it treats reality as optional. ArcJet lies because the timeline matters more than truth. The US Space Administration converts rockets into nukes because the military priority matters more than exploration. The public is fed a narrative while the actual costs get hidden in terminals and memos. And that leads us to the next company, which might be the most infuriating scandal on this whole list because it starts as a cleaning company and ends as chemical warfare and murder for corporate privacy. Abraxodyne. Cleanliness and criminality. Abraxodyne. Chemical is the kind of brand that wants you to picture Picture sparkling countertops and happy families. They research chemical products at their Pittsburgh facility, including prank cyanide tablets, rodent mace, industrial-grade drain cleaner, a chemical lab kit for kids, and glow-in-the-dark hairspray. That list alone feels like a satire of corporate responsibility. Here is your fun toy science kit for children. Also, here is cyanide as a prank. You cannot make this up. And yet Fallout did. Their first scandal is petty, which is how a lot of real scandals start. The experimental glow-in-the-dark hairspray is used on an employee as a prank, causing scarring and requiring surgery. The second scandal is not petty at all. They create industrial drain cleaners and send it out on a trial run without developing a neutralizer. The waste byproducts severely corrode the train cars of the Pittsburgh Union Railroad, make at least 3 railroad employees ill, strain relationships, and eventually the railroad refuses to transport the byproducts, forcing Abraxadine to store them in their own warehouse. This is classic corporate negligence. They invent a product, do not plan for disposal, and then act shocked when the world refuses to clean up their mess for them. Then it gets worse. Management refuses to properly supply equipment to the neutralizer research team. They use plastic waste barrels instead of metal barrels, despite the plastic barrel's tendency to leak and cause a reaction with the potential to devastate entire city blocks. And management encourages employees to repair leaking barrels with adhesive tape and Wonder Glue, citing financial circumstances out of our control. That line is so perfectly evil because it is so plausible. Sorry, we cannot afford safety. Please patch the potential doomsday substance with tape and glue. If you think Abraxadine's scandal is just waste disposal and workplace injury, that is the warm-up. The real scandal is Project Meadow Breeze, which is Abraxadine taking its chemical research and partnering with the U.S. Armed Forces to produce military-grade weaponry for the Sino-American War while keeping it under wraps to maintain the company's family-friendly image. That is Fallout in a nutshell. You sell cleaning products to families and sell chemical weapons to the military, and you do it with the same corporate logo. Project Meadow Breeze begins when a contact in the U.S. military approaches Abraxadine at a trade expo and asks about Abraxadine's incidents, which the employee rebuffs, worried the guy might be an undercover reporter. Then the contact reveals he is military and they are interested in the potential of Abraxadine's product. Meanwhile, Abraxadine's lab technicians have concerns about outdated broken equipment and request stronger respirators, and the company pushes forward anyway. It is the same pattern again. Pressure, opportunity. Ignore the safety people. Take the contract. The project becomes a weapon, a chemical warfare tool capable of decimating crops and ecosystems and even tearing through metal, with dangerous long-term effects on humans. This is not just a gun. This is industrial-scale environmental murder in a spray bottle. And if you are thinking, okay, but did anyone try to stop it? Yes, sort of. And that is where the scandal turns into a thriller. A marketing employee named Amrita starts keeping receipts of sensitive corporate information as leverage in case she is blamed for one of the company's errors. She digs deeper, finds references to Meadow Breeze, investigates, and collects evidence for months. The existence of the project gets leaked to a reporter, but the journalist is caught and dealt with before any negative press is published, protecting Abraxadine's reputation. That is not a metaphor. That is not they got sued. That is, they stopped the story by stopping the person. Then Amrita realizes the company has extra copies of holotapes she created, meaning the board is onto her. Another employee tries to warn her to move on before they retaliate, and then the board chooses the most corporate solution possible. They discreetly hire a hitman to kill Amrita. The order comes from Tony, a company executive who later exists post-war as the exec, and the lore is explicit that this was done to protect the company's interests and private business. If you have ever wanted a clean example of corporations in Fallout are basically governments, here it is. They do not just manage PR. They authorize assassinations. Imagine dying because you tried to do the correct thing, and the company response is basically, thank you for your feedback, we have forwarded your message to our hitman. And then, the post-war consequences hit like a truck. After the bombs, Meadow Breeze chemicals spill throughout southeastern Ohio, destroying the natural environment and creating a desert-like wasteland known as Burning Springs. Abraxadine also has a problem disposing of chemicals, and engages in unethical hazardous dumping and unsafe storage of chemical barrels, with examples like dumping at Tycoon Lake and unsafe barrel storage at Dino Peaks Mini Golf. The city of Athens is hit particularly hard after a train derails and spills Meadow Breeze chemicals, contaminating the town and worsening unrest. And the chemical devastation becomes associated with the Rust, a recognized source of havoc and natural destruction across the region. This is what makes Abraxadine's scandal special. Even in Fallout, it is not just people dying, it is geography dying. They turned a region into a wasteland twice, once with pre-war negligence and again with post-war fallout. Now for the one that might be the single most evil use of wholesome branding in the whole franchise. Mama Dolce's Communist Front. Mama Dolce's, on paper, is just an expanding East Coast packaged food company. Their tagline is literally an all-American business, which is hilarious in the worst way, because under the surface, Mama Dolce's was a front for Chinese intelligence operations on American soil, not had a few shady investors, not sold to a shell company, a straight-up espionage pipeline. In the corporate background, it's described as either founded by or acquired through shell companies, and then used as a cover operation for infiltration, with select facilities acting as entry points for operatives. And the gross part is, they weren't just doing spy stuff. They were also doing classic evil corporation stuff at the same time, because Fallout America can never commit to only one type of awful. Rising domestic shipping costs pushed them into creative cost-cutting, like increasing by product filler use from lumber affiliates. In plain English, they were putting wood into the food. And even better, the yellow 21B ink used on the packaging was also used as flavoring. Imagine getting a frozen dinner and the secret ingredient is printer ink. Like, congrats, you did not eat sweet and sour stroganoff, you ate a receipt. Now here's where it escalates from gross to legitimately scary. The People's Liberation Army front section is not subtle. One example it gives is the Arlington processing plant, which housed a contingent of special operatives. Not sympathizers, operatives. The Morgantown plant in Appalachia is even more ridiculous, because it sat on top of the Fujinia intelligence base, with research and development aimed at stealth technology and Liberator robots, and with a secondary goal of acquiring nuclear launch codes to American silos. So while Americans are buying frozen dinners, the basement is doing stealth tech R&D and trying to steal nukes. That is not a scandal. That is an entire Tom Clancy novel disguised as a food court. And because Fallout loves a detail that makes you feel worse, Mama Dolce's logistics were used to move real hardware. Weapons like Type 93 assault rifles and Shangxi Type 17 pistols were shipped into factories to arm infiltrators and American Fifth columnists. They also ran propaganda distribution through facilities, including radio stations like People's Republic of America Radio and propaganda flyers. The company even allowed the PLA to fast-track shipments of Mama Dolce's food through military priority, which is such an insane abuse of systems that it loops back around to being almost impressive. Like, yes, your nation is collapsing, but at least the frozen dinner brand gets priority clearance, because it is secretly an intelligence artery. And no, the US government was not totally clueless. US intelligence at Sugar Grove traced suspicious wire transfers and followed the money trail back to China months before the Great War, but couldn't act. So you get this perfect Fallout tragedy. They knew something was wrong. The system was too jammed up or too late to do anything meaningful, and then the world ends anyway. Post-war. This whole thing doesn't even cleanly end. If you're in the capital wasteland in 2027, the Mama Dolce's site is still tied to Chinese remnants. There's an encrypted terminal file that literally confirms Mama Dolce's was a front for Chinese intelligence and espionage in the DC area, and you decrypt it using an encryption key you loot from a Chinese remnant captain. Meaning 200 years later, the ghost of that infrastructure is still sitting there, armed, defended, and documented like the mission never got fully canceled. So what's the scandal? In one sentence, Mama Dolce's took the most boring, trusted, daily consumer thing imaginable and used it as a shield for foreign military infiltration, weapons movement, propaganda, and research projects with national security stakes. And they still managed to cheap out by feeding people wood and ink while they did it. That is like being betrayed by a Lunchable. Now, if Mama Dolce's is covert evil wearing an apron, then Hallucigen is corporate evil wearing a lab coat and insisting it's for your own good. Hallucigen Incorporated torture reformulated. Hallucigen is a pre-war company based in Boston that researched and developed non-lethal biochemical technology for the US Armed Forces and police forces, specifically for riot and crowd control in the wake of automation, food riots, and civil unrest. And that word non-lethal is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because the scandal is basically that most of their products either did not work or worked in the most horrifying way possible. Let's talk about their signature product, Hallucigen Gas. It's marketed like a clean little crowd control solution, delivered by a Type 2 fragmentation grenade, stored in canisters, reliable crowd control since 2055. And then you get the test results. On October 18th, 2077, testing revealed the gas caused traumatic adrenal gland rupture, hallucinations, erratic behavior, extreme aggression, and heart failure. Only one surviving subject began to acclimate before he was beaten to death by other frenzied subjects, and another died of heart failure. The lore we're given is blunt about it. Effectively, no test subjects survived exposure. So yeah, it's crowd control, in the sense that there is no crowd anymore. And here's the part that makes it feel like a real corporate scandal instead of a one-off accident. They tried to take this nightmare product and spread testing outside their facility. They sent canisters with an order estimate to Vivian Garahan at the Garahan Mining Company to help with mining protests in Appalachia. But Poseidon Energy bought the gas to end a union protest at Poseidon Energy Plant WV-06. The intended outcome was basically make protesters go crazy and turn on each other, which is already villain behavior. Instead, it caused protesters to attack attack the National Guard, spread exposure further, storm the plant, and kill everyone inside. So hallucinogens' non-lethal crowd control shows up in the real world, and it turns into a mass death cascade. And if you think that's where it ends, nope. Hallucinogen also had other products that scream, "We made this," then tried to pretend we didn't. Their dispersant is advertised as ideal for peacefully clearing an area of civilians, but a test on October 18th, 2077 triggered a panic and flight response so severe the subject ran when he saw his own child, got pursued by police, was apprehended 2 days later, and had to be institutionalized. The failure got the Mesmetron developer fired and replaced with a new project lead, because of course the solution is swap managers and keep going. Then there's the Eradicator, which is maybe my favorite example of Fallout corporate insanity, because the marketing language is trying so hard to keep a straight face. It was intended to be a portable field decontaminator. It ended up being a 2-ton machine that removes all biological and chemical contaminants by applying 5,100 rads to test subjects, resulting in near-instant body collapse. It was reclassified as a lethal weapon, and it was potent enough that they had to strip the chamber and rebuild it after each test. Like, imagine being on the team that has to write the report. Good news, the contaminants are gone. Bad news, so is the person. And the scandal gets even creepier when you tie it into Vault-Tec. Hallucinogen was contracted by Vault-Tec to devise a psychoactive compound to manipulate the mood of vault dwellers. So even if you strip away the riot control angle, this company was also being used to chemically manage a captive population in the vaults. In other words, the non-lethal tech company is also doing, how do we dose people into compliance research for the biggest social experiment machine ever built? So yeah, Hallucinogen's scandal is the lie of non-lethal. They sold chemical and radiological horrors as public safety tools, field tested them into mass casualty events, and still got contracts tied to Vault-Tec mood manipulation. And the wildest part is, this all happens right at the edge of the Great War. October 18th, 2077 shows up again and again. Society is already cracking. These companies are already panicking. And their answer is to build products that make people die faster and more violently, then call it control. Now, let's lighten the mood for exactly 2 seconds with something that seems goofy until you realize it's actually one of the most realistic corporate scandals in the entire Fallout universe. Soft drink sabotage. Vim Pop Incorporated. Spoiled soda. If you've played Far Harbor, you know Vim is basically main culture in a bottle. The company is old, founded in 1931, started as a health tonic, never got the national dominance Nuka-Cola did, but had a strong regional identity. It's the classic underdog brand. And in 2077, its main competitor is Nuka-Cola. And you already know where this is going, because if Nuka-Cola can't beat you in marketing, apparently it can beat you with crime. By late 2077, Vim Pop is struggling financially. At the end of the third quarter in October 2077, they're nearly $3.29 million in the red, and more than 20% of expenditures are going toward repairs, which is more than marketing, production, or distribution. They also just got out of trademark litigation with Nuka-Cola over the Quartz name and lost, which cost them further revenue. Investors are losing faith and considering selling their stock to Nuka-Cola, effectively turning Vim into a subsidiary. It's corporate pressure from every angle. CEO Doyle Reed tries to fight back with aggressive campaigns. They run a Vim ambassador advertisement push with power-armored brand ambassadors traveling around handing out free bottles and doing outreach, which is such a Fallout detail because of course the soda company has power armor spokespeople. And then, immediately, the campaign gets hit with crime. One suit gets stolen off the truck. An ambassador gets randomly assaulted in a bar. Delivery trucks get stolen and shot up. Drivers get jumped. Machines get tampered with. Their head of distribution, Willis Rudd, starts saying, "This is coordinated, not bad luck." And management keeps telling him to downplay it. Here's the scandal reveal. Willis Rudd was right. Nuka-Cola hired Aubrey Copland to sabotage Vim. Pop Incorporated and pushed them into a buyout. It's laid out in phases like a business plan, because capitalism does not sleep, even when it's doing sabotage. Phase 1 is about disrupting local confidence, put out-of-order signs on vending machines, replace cases with tainted bottles, cover Vim ads with Nuka-Cola ads. Phase 2 escalates with thefts and assaults on workers to lower morale. Obvious enough to scare people, subtle enough to avoid a full investigation. Phase 3 is stealing the recipe for their newest soft drink, Captain's Blend, so Nuka-Cola can beat them to it. That is not competition. That is hostile takeover by street crime. And the nastiest part, the part that feels like a real corporate scandal you'd see in an actual documentary, is the inside job. Madison Young is working from inside the company, pointing out losses to investors and steering them toward Nuka-Cola. Willis Rudd even tries to organize a meeting to figure out how to defend themselves, but his push for hazard pay is denied, and he's told to keep things quiet. So Vim is getting hit from outside and inside, and the leadership response is basically, please do not acknowledge the sabotage you are actively experiencing. This one is disturbing in a different way than hallucinogen, because nobody here is inventing a murder gas. It's just the cold corporate math of destroying a smaller competitor, not through better product, but through systematic destabilization, and Fallout makes it sting because Vim is local pride, its identity. It's that little regional, we're not like the rest of you thing that people cling to when everything else is falling apart. And Nuka-Cola's answer is to send someone to poison the reputation, assault the workers, and steal the formula. It's petty, it's greedy, it's extremely believable. If all of this is what happens when all corporations know how to do is lying, sabotaging, and murdering to protect their brand, then Big MT is what happens when a company stops pretending it has a brand at all. Big Mountain, perverted science. And I know what you might be thinking. Big MT is just the place where that goofy DLC with talking appliances and brain jars takes place. It is funny, but it is also one of the darkest corporate stories in Fallout, because the comedy is basically a mask over a very simple truth. Big MT was a privately owned defense contractor and research center that built miracles and monsters in the same breath, and a lot of those monsters did not stay in the crater. Here is the scandal in its purest form. Big MT was built to create the future of mankind and make technology of tomorrow without restraint. It attracted some of the most gifted pre-war scientists and conducted groundbreaking research that was also explicitly unethical, including experiments on living humans. Both American volunteers and Chinese American detainees suspected as communist spies. That phrase alone should make your stomach drop, because it tells you the whole story. The company was a machine that turned people into test subjects whenever it was convenient, but the next detail is where it stops feeling like evil research lab and becomes corporate state. Big MT had its own concentration camp safeguarded by lucrative contracts with the US Army. That is not me being dramatic. That is the lore. There is a literal camp inside the Big MT ecosystem, and the survivors of that camp are proof of what Big MT did with access to captive populations. Little Yangtze is one of the most upsetting locations in Old World Blues, and it is basically the corporate scandal made physical. These were Chinese citizens imprisoned before the Great War, used as human guinea pigs for Big MT's experiments, with prisoners constantly trucked in and abducted at night for medical experiments. Attempts to report the abuse got them solitary confinement and no action. Guards were overworked trying to stop escapes, and eventually explosive collars were requisitioned to keep people from leaving the perimeter. That is not just war crime. That is a system. That is a supply chain of suffering. And if you want the most Fallout punchline imaginable, those prisoners do not even get to be left alone after the world ends. They are abandoned after the Great War, become ghouls, and later get exploited again by Elijah experimenting on them with collar tech that helps lead to the explosive collars used at the Sierra Madre. It is like the universe itself refuses to let them rest. The scandal is not one incident. It is the fact that the infrastructure of cruelty keeps being reused by whoever finds it next. Now, let me say something that is going to sound like a joke, but it is not. Big MT is what happens when a corporation builds a playground so big that it forgets the world outside exists, then its toys start leaking into the world anyway. That is literally in the think tank lore. Dr. Mobius keeps the think tank's attention focused on Big MT and away from the outside world, but the experiments still leak out to threaten wastelanders, including creatures like Cazadores and Night Stalkers. So even when they are contained, they are not contained. Scientists forgot the outside world. Scientists forgot the outside world exists is not a metaphor for being out of touch. It is literally the plot, and somehow they still manage to ship their disasters anyway. The next scandal is the one that makes Big MT feel uniquely dangerous compared to the other companies we covered. Abraxodine killed whistleblowers to protect a contract. Hallucigen built non-lethal tools that killed everyone. Mama Dolce's used frozen dinners as a spy pipeline. Big MT went a step further. When budget cuts hit, Big MT executives did not just cut programs. They improvised alternate funding by striking deals with third parties, exchanging experimental technology for money and privileges. That sounds like normal corporate behavior until you realize what they were trading, and what they were willing to do to get more subjects, because the lore gets explicit. It got to the point that they began secretly assassinating non-military targets under Project Hare and exhuming buried US citizens under Project Burke to procure research subjects. That is the corporate scandal right there, not we did a bad experiment. The company is so committed to research without restraint that when the subject pipeline runs dry, it creates one through murder and grave robbing. That is not science. That is predation with lab equipment. And this is where Big MT becomes the thematic final boss of the whole video. Big MT is all of the corporate, selfish, ethically devoid impulses of a corporation combined, but scaled up into an entire research civilization. When money was tight, they sold the future to the highest bidder. When ethics were inconvenient, they threw them out. When bodies were needed, they found bodies. Now we need to talk about the moment Big MT literally blew up its own name. Big MT was originally named for the mountain above the research center. Then a failed experiment by Dr. Klein in the Y0 Research Center vaporized the mountain, leaving behind a giant crater and exposing the facility. And the most disturbing part is not that it happened, it is how they reacted. The researchers were basically not fazed and continued pushing the boundaries of science. Imagine your company headquarters vaporizes the mountain it is under, and the response is, well, we have more land for testing now. That is what they did. They adapted the newly exposed land for more facilities, including things like a test town and an artillery battery for experimenting with live ordnance. This is why I call it a scandal, and not just crazy science. The defining feature is the absence of brakes. There is no stop. There is no this is too far. There is only continue. Now we have to talk about the people of Big MT, because the think tank is a corporate scandal in character form. Big MT was run by an executive team, the think tank, headed by Dr. Klein. Under their guidance, Big MT created incredible technologies and incredible horrors. This is the part where Fallout tries to make you laugh, because the think tank talks like cartoon scientists, but their output reads like a list of war crimes that learned how to walk. On the technology side, Big MT produces things like advanced stealth suits, holograms, hazmat suits, new alloys like Saturnite, cyberdogs, and more. On the horror side, it produces Cazadores, Night Stalkers, mutagenic plants, toxins of unnatural lethality, and even ambulatory corpses, plus other creations that are basically, what if a lab accident became a regional predator? That split is why Big MT is so important to this topic. Their scandal is not one product. Their scandal is that their entire business model is break reality, then see what happens. And you, the player, are living in the consequences. Because Big MT's automated processes also create lobotomites out of people who approach the facility. Most lobotomites are former residents or wanderers collected by robotic drones and brought to the medical facility where the autodoc replaces major organs with electronic equivalents. The system is meant to keep Big MT secret, because only a brain inside a functioning human body can bypass the radar fence, but the autodoc's programming problem ends up destroying or lobotomizing brains, leaving mindlessly aggressive shells. So even the security system is a scandal. It is a machine that takes people and turns them into disposable maintenance monsters. If you want a single image that sums up Big MT's corporate evil, it is this. People wander too close. The company does not warn them away. The company does not arrest them. The company harvests them. Then it uses their bodies for cleaning duties. That is a corporation behaving like a predator species. Another joke, because otherwise I will spiral. Big MT is the only company where we will onboard you means we will remove your brain and replace your organs with electronics. And HR is a robot that thinks your name is test subject. Now, let's talk about why Big MT did not just destroy people inside its walls, but also reshaped the world outside. The Big MT lore straight up says their outputs were sold to private parties in exchange for favors. One of the most important examples is Frederick Sinclair obtaining experimental tech in return for letting Big MT use the Sierra Madre and its inhabitants as proving grounds, which backfires catastrophically when the tech turns on the casino inhabitants and dooms them, helping create the Madre's reputation as a poisonous death trap. That is the corporate scandal with a bow on it. They are not just doing unethical science. They are exporting unethical science into populated areas, then moving on when it goes wrong. And it was not unprecedented. The weather station terminal entries mentions Hopeville being tested. And what happened? It was wiped off the map by a disastrous meteorological experiment as part of another exchange. Big MT is basically a company that can erase towns as collateral damage and treat it like an acceptable trade-off for a contract. That is where it stops being fun DLC lore and becomes, this is why the world was already doomed. So if you ask, what was Big MT's scandal? The answer is yes. Human experimentation, captive camp populations, lethal automation, corporate assassination and grave robbing for subjects, selling unstable super science to the highest bidder, creating predators that leak into the wasteland, erasing towns as side effects. It is the purest expression of pre-war corporate rot because Big MT had everything the other companies wanted: military contracts, secrecy, funding, talent, and they used it to build a future that no sane society would ever accept if it had to look directly at the price tag. While entering the wastelands of the Fallout universe for the first time, many of you may have had questions that appear simple at first glance, even dumb, though as you play through the Fallout series, they were almost certainly eclipsed by the greater mysteries within the universe. Today, we're presenting you with Fallout's dumbest questions explained, so that these questions can possibly be answered and put to rest the idea that those questions were dumb in the first place, as many of them have only vague answers that require a bit of extra diving to conclude. What are Stimpaks? Stimpaks are amongst the most most useful items in the game, as players would most certainly have a hard time surviving the perils of the wasteland without them. They're pretty much essential to the story, as without the health regeneration that they provide, most large waves of enemies would not be possible to defeat without the occasional run, hide, health, and go back at it. Could you imagine how difficult the raid bosses, or even the nuke bosses of Fallout 76 would be if Stimpaks were not easily acquired? You practically have to spam the Stimpak hotkey during the raid to survive for even a few seconds, especially during the final boss Ultrasight Terror, as its sheer damage output is enough to wipe most teams in seconds. But what are Stimpaks, and where did they come from? That might seem like a dumb question, but there isn't actually much we know about their origins. What we do know is that Stimpaks are a handheld syringe-delivered medication that provides its benefits through direct injection into the bloodstream. Stimpak is short for Stimulation Delivery Package, and their payload rapidly boosts the body's own regenerative properties. The exact concoction within them is unknown, but what we do know is that they're loaded with a variety of healing medications and stimulants, appearing similar to a real-world EpiPen. They were originally intended to be used in conjunction with an autodoc, which is a miracle of pre-war medical technology in its own right, as it's capable of performing even the most complex medical procedures without requiring a full staff of qualified medical personnel laboring for constant hours to ensure that every incision is preformed with the utmost care. At some point, the Stimpaks were released commercially on their own. Curiously enough, Stimpaks can be used to heal injured animals as well, as in the Fallout Amazon series we are shown dog meat being healed by the ghoulified Cooper Howard. They can even be used on mutants, such as super mutants and ghouls. Though their genetics are far beyond that of a normal human, the more common Stimpaks are mostly apt at healing minor injuries, and not capable of healing the more severe wounds, leading to the advanced variant known as the Super Stimpak to be created. There are also additional variants, such as the Stimpak Diffuser, which distributes aerosolized Stimpak healing in a localized area, diluted and even expired Stimpaks, indicating that the fluid inside can expire or become diluted, as well as automatically injecting regular and Super Stimpaks for when you need healing, but can't waste time pressing buttons on your Pip-Boy to do it yourself. The Super Stimpak contains an additional vial of more potent healing chems, providing an exponentially increased healing effect. However, it should be noted that Super Stimpaks are known to cause minor tissue trauma to the healed areas, due to the potency of its medications. So, lore-wise, it's not really a good idea to rely on these more advanced Stimpaks. Though an inventor and distributor is never mentioned for either the Autodoc or Stimpaks, we can find a very similar technology called health dispensers that were used by the United States military during the events of the liberation of Anchorage. These were manufactured by Lee Rapid Pharmaceuticals and use a very similar delivery method, which utilizes a hose, gauge, and needle. This could imply that the Stimpaks we see throughout the Fallout series were also produced by the Lee Rapid Pharmaceuticals company for the civilian market. Unlike Stimpaks, health dispensers are bulky and contain more than one usage. Whether this is true or not, it should be noted that players can actually find a recipe to craft Stimpaks of their own using medicinal herbs during the events of the Honest Hearts DLC for Fallout New Vegas. This requires Brock flower and Xander root, or not. Those are ingredients used in the production of actual Stimpaks is anyone's guess. Where do ghouls originate? Starting out the Fallout series, we are led to believe that ghouls are merely a byproduct of living creatures mutated by prolonged and rapid exposure to radiation. As most creatures would have been killed by it, ghouls were molded by it into a form that bears a shocking resemblance to the mythical ghouls of old folklore. This process is known as ghoulification, and in humans seems to result in near immortality, with a side effect that they eventually go feral and forget all of who they were. The trade-off for that risk is enhanced regeneration of wounds, even the ability to completely regrow severed limbs or reattached fallen ones, with those limbs maintaining full function. Ghouls also boast a natural immunity to radiation exposure, with radiation exposure providing an even greater boost to their regenerative abilities. The ghoulification process renders those unfortunate enough to undergo it completely infertile, with most of their hair falling out and their skin resembling burn victims. The majority of the ghouls that players will come across are feral and will attack on sight, healing most Wastelanders to refer to as zombies, a slur to ghouls that comes from pre-war movies. Most Wastelanders consider them a separate species entirely, leading them to become outcasts of society, and more than often be shot on sight, as it's hard for many to distinguish them from the more common ferals that descended from the pre-war cities. After large populations were struck by nuclear radiation when the bombs were dropped, those feral ghouls rely solely entirely on animalistic instinct and aggressively pursue any baseline human and potential prey they come across. This has led many non-feral ghouls to form their own societies, which often utilizes feral ghouls as protection. Though many ghouls continue to refer to themselves as ghouls, there are some individuals who prefer other terms for their kind, such as Doc Barrows, a ghoul doctor and scientist from the ghoul community of Underworld in the capital Wasteland, who prefers the term necrotic post-humans, or alternatively, post-necrotic humans. Of the many species that have been known to experience ghoulification, there are few that you may not have even realized were ghouls, with the most notable being mongrels, which are feral ghoul canines, and yaoguai, which are ghoul bears. Though it's unknown whether these ghouls are still feral, as some yaoguai are known to have offspring and mongrels can be found in packs, with even alphas leading them. Ghoul gorillas, playfully named ghoul-rillas, can also be found in the ruins of Nuka World during the Fallout 4 DLC of the same name in the Safari Adventure Zone, with their own human among them. Though many might believe that ghouls are solely a byproduct of the bombs dropping at the culmination of the Great War and the heavy radiation unleashed upon the wasteland after that, what many will eventually uncover is that there are plenty of ghouls that had already been ghoulified prior of that fateful day that would make the Fallout universe into what we know it as today. Curie will mention during encounters with ghouls that a doctor by the name of Platt predicted the future existence of ghouls, though it seems that ghouls may have already existed in the shadows prior to that. Isolated medical experimentation would be conducted prior to the Great War that would transform individuals into what would eventually go on to be known as ghouls, though many wealthy individuals would eventually seek out ghoulification as a means of attaining immortality. Experiments were conducted in hopes of creating a cure for radiation that sought to provide radiation immunity in anticipation of the nuclear holocaust that would come to pass. An unnamed company located in Boston, Massachusetts would experiment with such a drug, with a research assistant known by her last name, Peters, would volunteer to test such a cure on herself. Holotapes recorded by her can be found in an abandoned house located in the ruins of Charlestown during the events of Fallout 4. Her holotapes make it clear that in February 2077, she would expose herself to 6 sieverts of radiation before testing treatment serum, though, as it turns out, she was actually part of the trial's control group, so the treatment she administered was a placebo with no effects on the radiation that afflicted her, leaving one last farewell message to her parents in the event that her treatment failed. Though she had been given a placebo, she would succumb to the effects of the radiation, and instead of dying, she would instead become a feral ghoul, though in the mid-2020s, a man by the name of John McDonough would acquire the only remaining sample of this drug and sought it as a way to gain a new sense of self, seeking to cure his emotional instability and self-hatred. John would go on to change his last name to Hancock and found the town of Goodneighbor, acting as its mayor and a potential follower during the events of Fallout 4. During the recently released Fallout 76 expansions, The Ghoul Within, players were given the option to undergo a similar experiment and become a ghoul themselves. Meeting Parthenia Blankenship, a ghoul scientist and member of the all-ghoul faction known as the Revenants, who reside at Radiant Hills, she will offer the player the option to make their character a ghoul, using a serum she created. Her father was a general in the United States military, and was stationed at a nuclear missile silo in Appalachia, and her mother was in the picture, so she was given permission to live at the missile silo with her father. After a nuclear warhead malfunctioned during the start of the Great War and failed to lift off, she was abandoned by her father and left alone at the silo. Parthenia was an avid reader and would study the only paper material she had at her exposure, which involved laboratory equipment and military secrets. She would uncover experiment chemicals that had been transported from another location and seemed to exhibit advanced healing properties, leading her to conduct experiments on herself using the chemicals, which lead to her discovering the process of ghoulification. According to Parthenia, very little documentation had been provided with the chemical at the silo, and she was unable to determine where it had originated, though her research would allow her to become familiar enough that she can describe its molecular structure. Parthenia would discover that ultracite ore, when used alongside the chemical, would speed up the process of ghoulification, and by 2105, this was able to create an injection-free delivery method using an inhaler. Desmond Lockhart, a British international intelligence agent prior in the year 2077, would be amongst the global leaders and members of the intelligence community that sought to extend their lifespan and genetic ability in hopes that they could survive the bombs dropping and rebuild society. He would expose himself to controlled levels of lethal radiation, and perhaps even use the same serum that Hancock had obtained and Peter sought to test, to make himself into a ghoul. He even reveals that he was not the only one to seek out ghoulification prior to the war, which could indicate that there are many more pre-war ghouls out there waiting for future installments to uncover. A criminal mobster by the name of Eddie Winter would experiment with radiation decontamination on himself after a physician in East Boston presented him with the theory that the right kind of radiation exposure at the right amounts could mutate human cells. He would coerce the owners of the Wicked Ship Company to smuggle him some nuclear materials, and with the help of his physician, he would undergo the experiment and transform into a ghoul in October 2077, living the next 210 years sealed inside a secret bunker in Boston that he had commissioned after he was alerted to the threat of nuclear war breaking out, only being discovered during the events of Fallout 4. Strangely enough, the company that had been creating the serum that would enable the willing to become a ghoul may have been Robco, or even the United States Army. As in the Commonwealth, there is a hidden robotics research facility underneath the Robco Sales and Service Center that had conducted transhuman medical experiments on prisoners given to them by the US military for the development of robobrains to use in the Great War. The facility was top secret, and workers would frequently disappear, with management establishing protocols for the quick destruction of evidence should it be needed. In a brig behind dozens of mechanically sealed doors, feral ghouls can be found deadlocked jail cells that had open-view glass ceilings, with an observation room above, so their transformations could be studied. Several of these ghouls can be found strapped to gurneys held on tracks in the floor that would carry them into laboratories for dissection, and they would be incinerated upon completion. There is a row of decontamination arches at a mandatory checkpoint along this track. Outside of the cells, human remains can be found, distinct from the ghoul remains, which generally remain restrained or imprisoned. In the research area, tanks containing the remains of feral ghouls can also be found. If this isn't enough to point the finger at Robco, because in Cranberry Bog of West Virginia, another Robco research center can be found that contained a feral ghoul sealed within an observation chamber underground. Why are radroaches big? Have you ever heard the old wise tale that cockroaches can survive a nuclear bomb? Well, shockingly enough, this is somewhat true, though not entirely. Amongst the first types of enemies encountered in every Fallout game after Fallout 2 are the radroaches, which are the ancestors of American cockroaches that have mutated over centuries to be far more massive and hunt in packs. Contrary to popular belief, while the name radroach was introduced in Fallout 3, giant cockroaches had appeared in Fallout Tactics and were to reappear in Van Buren as well. Prior to the Great War, American cockroaches were already the largest species of cockroach commonly found in homes and commercial buildings. Known for their speed and ability to thrive in warm, damp environments, they are even capable of flying short distances and are often found in basements, sewers, and around pipes and drains. They're practically anywhere that they can find food. Because they're omnivorous and will eat almost anything, including normally toxic waste products such as grease, they can even chew through leather. With their dietary habits so diverse, perhaps what benefited American cockroaches the most is that they're capable of surviving for months without food, though they can only survive about a week without water. According to BBC Science Focus, a cockroach can only survive between 6 and 15 times the lethal radiation dose for humans, meaning that water sources that would have been rendered toxic to humans after the Great War could be ingested by cockroaches without a problem. So, while it is true that they're mostly immune to radiation, they can still be affected by it. We see that in glowing radroaches that might act as the ghoulified variants of their species, though they are shown to interact with the rest of their kind just fine. They're become so large after the war that they're about the size of a house cat, with a massive thorax that could fend off attacks from much larger predators. With their massive reinforced incisors, in numbers they are capable of taking down and devouring much larger prey, including humans. So imagine smashing a cockroach just for a pack of much larger cockroaches to swarm out from the dark recesses of your house and attempt to devour you whole. Radroaches are no laughing matter, as they've been shown time and time again as being capable of taking down entire vaults. Such a threat that they are possibly the only reason why the Lone Wanderer was capable of escaping Vault 101 before its security could properly react, as they were dealing with a seemingly organized radroach attack. Radroaches, just like their pre-war counterparts, can be found in most places underground and anywhere that they might be able to eat across the entirety of North America. Some wastelanders, such as Ma June in the Fallout television series, use their ability to digest nearly anything to farm them as a reliable source of meat, though it's easy for them to grow into a problem if they're left to grow out of control, as a group of survivors from Vault 31 would learn after Ma June's radroach farm was unleashed upon them. To more seasoned survivors, they're less likely to pose a challenge, as adept wastelanders can dispatch a pack of them if they're aware of the radroach's approach. Radroaches are territorial and rather aggressive, but seem to be capable of distinguishing what targets are vulnerable, as they will only attack when they feel threatened if they encounter a larger creature. Basically, all the traits that allowed their real-world counterparts, the American cockroach, to survive is further enhanced by their mutated size. But why are they so big? It turns out to be quite simple. Insects are poikilothermic, which means that they cannot maintain a constant body temperature and rely on external temperatures to regulate their heat. As temperatures suddenly rose due to the intense nuclear fallout that engulfed most of the planet, insect species experienced thermal stress, which real-world research has indicated would affect their behavior and their size. As temperatures increase, some insects will become larger due to increased heat, though the impact of heat will also increase their metabolic rate and lead to more aggressive behavior. Since after the war, there were corpses everywhere, and no one left to smash them, cockroaches were able to feast on anything they could get their mandibles on, which allowed their size to grow until they reached a point of environmental stability where available food sources could sustain their size. It's possible that the FEV leaking out of research institutions and unfortunate vaults could have also impacted their growth, though due to them remaining largely intact in form, it's unlikely. Why are bottle caps currency? It might feel off to fans introduced to the Fallout series through the television series that bottle caps have become the de facto currency and the standard that generally every trader is more than willing to accept. As in the real world, we wouldn't think twice about leaving a discarded bottle cap in a trash receptacle to be sent to the garbage dump. They're generally considered not worth the effort in collecting, as they have no value, but in the Fallout series, they're universally sought after in the American wasteland, from California all the way to Boston. So why are bottle caps the standard currency? Prior to the outbreak of the Great War, Dr. Mobius, one of the Big MT think tank executives and a prominent scientist, predicted that due to their durability, portability, and that they can be instantly recognized, bottle caps would become one of the most common currencies accepted in a post-war North America, ultimately proving true. The first known civilization to use bottle caps as a currency and validate Dr. Mobius's claim would be the Hub, establishing its acceptance in the year 2093, with the Hub being a major trading station in New California due to its oasis that provided wastelanders with a source of clean water that traders originating from the Hub would use to establish it as a powerhouse. They would select bottle caps for one very important reason. They were limited. This is because the technology to manufacture new bottle caps had been lost, and if new bottle caps could be minted, the method used to paint their surfaces with the various pre-war logos had also been lost, which is why you can't forge fake Sunset Sarsaparilla Star bottle caps and have them accepted by Old Fetus for his treasure, as he was the pre-war robotic mascot for the Sunset Sarsaparilla Soda Company and would know a fake when he saw one due to the paint not quite matching what they would have done pre-war. With the lack of machinery to produce new bottle caps, this made counterfeiting efforts almost impossible. Even the metals used in their production would have to be made using a specific composition of metals in order for a bottle cap to be accepted as genuine. With only a limited number of bottle caps out there, it preserves their value against inflation, though caravan companies, such as the Crimson Caravan Company, would aggressively target counterfeiters and destroy machinery that could be used to produce more so that nobody could inflate the currency. Though not all bottle cap presses would be destroyed, caravan companies were allowed to keep a few to replace worn-out and damaged bottle caps, so that they could keep the currency stable. As all currencies need to be backed by some sort of standard, such as the gold and silver standards that were abolished by the United States in 1933 and replaced with the economic trust standard, the merchants of the Hub would support bottle caps as a common unit of exchange by backing it with pure fresh water. There's a chance that the common use of bottle caps on the East Coast could have spawned in Appalachia around 2096, which would have only been 3 years after it had been established in the Hub. In order to promote the release of Nuka-Cola Quantum, the Nuka-Cola Corporation would partner with the White Spring Resort of West Virginia. As part of the partnership deal, all of the robotic vendors found at the White Spring Mall were programmed to accept bottle caps instead of dollars, which allowed wastelanders who found the nearly intact resort to exchange bottle caps they scavenged for virtually anything they would need to survive in the post-apocalyptic world. After which, the prominent caravan company operating around the region, the Blue Ridge Caravan, would spread the use of the currency as they are known to have trade routes that extend all the way from Kentucky to Georgia. The thing is, we can't really be sure, as a lot of what was established in Fallout 76 is already fated to be destroyed in the time of Fallout 3, but there is a chance that bottle caps could have simply become the norm in the eastern half of America prior to whatever calamity would undergo the survivors of the Appalachian wasteland. Perhaps the most definitive answer for why bottle caps are the standard currency in the Fallout franchise comes from none other than Scott Campbell, a developer who worked on the first 2 Fallout games under the Interplay banner. He recounted the day that he and his fellow Fallout designer, Brian Fryermuth, began to spitball ideas for what the currency would be. They couldn't use a pure bartering system, as it would have been too difficult for players to understand the value of items. They were considering bullets, as they are definitely useful in the wasteland, but they scrapped that idea when they realized that people would be very hesitant to use things like machine guns, since every trigger pull would directly lower their bank accounts, and that level of financial restraint wouldn't be enjoyable. So Scott Campbell thought to himself, what shiny token-sized thing would you find strewn around the trash piles? Something common, but not so common as to be be everywhere? And Eureka, he came up with the idea of bottle caps. Scott especially liked that the sound of a string of bottle caps would be very similar to that of a coin purse. Bottle caps seem to have been an interesting conclusion to a dilemma that they needed to solve in a logical manner, cementing it as a staple of the Fallout franchise, and establishing a strong lore supporting its widespread use that would only continue to grow more prominent for years to come as trade routes between settlements grew themselves. Why is civilization stunted? Eventually, every fan of the Fallout series has that moment where they question why there has been such little growth in the nearly 220 years that the games and television show expand through. Why are there no larger civilizations? Communities like Diamond City, Good Neighbor, Rivet City, Megaton, and the NCR are the outliers, with the vast majority of Wastelanders devolving into psychopathic raiders that will sooner try to eat you than prolong their lives through simple and honest trade. Raiders are everywhere. You don't have to go far from one raider outpost before finding another, with every raider faction being fiercely against one another, and many of them prefer to just butcher their victims rather than enslave them for labor. These raiders are cruel, committing vile acts on their victims and with little to no remorse, with no desire to ease their lives in the slightest by simply growing a farm. Could it be that there is one simple answer for why society has been unable to flourish in the post-apocalyptic hellscape that is Fallout? Sure, one could say that the abundance of chems available to the average Wastelander could be why they're so aggressive. With junkies mainly being driven by the goal of achieving their next high, it's more than likely something far more different. There seems to be a far more sinister poison lurking just beneath the surface of the Fallout franchise that will effectively doom civilization for centuries onward, with the only civilizations to thrive being those who can reach untainted waters deeper within the Earth's crust. This shadowy truth could be that everyone is indeed suffering from prolonged exposure to lead. Such exposure is known to cause an increase in the likelihood of future criminal activity, often causing individuals to develop an especially violent nature akin to the raiders we see throughout the Fallout franchise. Studies have even shown that individuals with elevated levels of lead in their bone marrow and blood tissue will be more aggressive, destructive, and express antisocial behavior. This would affect individuals in a way that would lead to an increased likelihood to use chems, as lead poisoning will also hinder attention spans and decreased cognitive performance, making them more likely to abuse chems that would otherwise only be used to treat illnesses. It's very evident by the poor working conditions found in terminal entries throughout the game, with a general disregard for human life shown in the form of experiments performed on unsuspecting United States citizens. Environmental conservation and regulations weren't really a thing that people cherished pre-war. The Fallout timeline separates from our own around the end of World War II, in September of 1945, and laws preventing the use of lead pipes hadn't been passed until 1986 with the Safe Drinking Water Act. So it's very unlikely that the United States of the Fallout timeline ever committed to preventing the use of lead pipes, as they can still be found throughout the game series, and especially in Fallout 4 and 76, where they are used as weapons. With lead contaminating virtually everything, it's no wonder why aggression is the typical response that both humans and creatures of the wasteland undergo when they spot something that does not look like them. It's no secret that low intelligence bears prejudice and hate. More often, ghouls are subject to that hate more than any other group. We've seen what happens when groups are able to undergo the process of cleaning their drinking water and the ground soil where they harvest their crops. The Brotherhood of the East Coast was able to build an empire that allowed them to establish contact and even construct airships to travel across the continent and meet up with other Brotherhood chapters. This was only due to Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 completing Project Purity and cleansing the Potomac River, one thing that greatly benefited society in that region. The NCR was able to achieve vast societal growth through the hub's oasis and developments in deep penetrating water purification systems, allowing their nation to read from LA to New Vegas, before collapsing and devolving due to external sabotage in the heart of their society that reintroduced the very contaminates that poisoned the minds of Wastelanders before such achievements had been perfected. Areas like the ruins of Pittsburgh, now known simply as the Pit, are contaminated with so many toxins that only raiders who rule by brutal punishment and cruelty are able to survive, showcasing just how bad the toxins of the old world are continuing to doom the wasteland all these years later. This is the reason why the Sole Survivor, Lone Wanderer, and Vault Dweller are capable of achievements far beyond the average Wastelander, as they're unaffected by the lead effects of prolonged lead exposure due to their upbringing having been spared the more rapid poisons unleashed upon society with the dropping of the bombs. Hopefully this video has helped you realize that in the Fallout universe, there are no truly dumb questions, and the answers for what seem to be simple questions can take us so deep that we are exploring long-lost secret laboratories and simulations meant to prepare soldiers for war overseas. Every protagonist of the Fallout series has one common piece of equipment that distinguishes them apart from nearly every Wastelander encountered in the Fallout series. But Pip-Boys are not limited to just one model. There are plenty, and with each model's functionality allowed for users to achieve so much more. This is why today, we're bringing you the Every Fallout Pip-Boy explained in X minutes. Overview. In a deal with Robco, the Senior Junior Vice President of Vault-Tec, Bud Askins, secured that Pip-Boys would be a piece of standard equipment for all Vault-Tec vaults. The personal information processor, known by most people as the Pip-Boy, and its technology, gives its users the upper hand that allows them to achieve their goals and survive against brutal odds that no one else can achieve. Under this deal, every Vault-Tec member of management would receive one as well. Their vaults would be packed full of them, allowing for every survivor of the Great War that had secured themselves a spot in the vaults to have a Pip-Boy to make their day-to-day tasks easier. And before you go, okay cool, it's a wrist computer, here's the scary part. Pip-Boys are not delicate. They're not a phone that dies in 4 hours because you looked at one video and forgot to put it to sleep mode. The lore straight up describes them as running on an internal fission battery and being hardy enough to survive basically anything, which is why some of them get passed around like heirlooms. So the Pip-Boy isn't just something you use, it's something that outlives you, which is extremely comforting until you remember what kind of company Vault-Tec was and how much they loved documenting people. Pip-Boy Model 1.0. The Pip-Boy 1.0 was the earliest known functioning model of the electronic personal information processor and came about in the middle of the 21st century, decades before the Great War. Being the prototype and the first ever iteration of the Pip-Boy, it was also Robco's learning phase, where they would test what their technology was capable of producing and refine what worked. This Pip-Boy was met with many flaws that would be addressed in later models. The Pip-Boy 1.0 was bulky and cumbersome, with a small display screen that sported a 16-button keyboard, a toggle switch, multiple indicator lights, and a dial that allowed users to switch between settings. In its infancy, its metallic frame did not help its users as it just added to the weight of the forearm-mounted computer. Outside of its frame, the internals were largely exposed, leaving its hardware vulnerable to everyday use. To add to this, its cords were also strung about, which put its wiring at risk of entanglement as well. It's unclear if these Pip-Boys ever went into mass production, as the only one of these found in the series was discovered within a warehouse at Area 51 by the Brotherhood of Steel's Knights of San Fernando chapter in 2296. Its inclusion in Area 51, alongside technology of extraterrestrial origins, brings into question whether or not the original Pip-Boys had been a human design based on alien technology, perhaps even the tech used in Zatan spacesuits. What we do know is that the next model of Pip-Boy would excel at virtually every area that the Pip-Boy Model 1.0 had failed. Pip-Boy Model 2000. The Pip-Boy 2000 would cement itself as a vital tool organizing the day-to-day life of those fortunate enough to purchase one. Its simple wrist-mounted design allowed users to keep track of their activities, store important information such as data, travel logs, and various other useful tools. It even sported a fully functional global positioning system that assisted its users in getting to where they needed to go in a route that made traveling much easier for the corporate leaders that would be amongst the first to adopt its use. Though it was considered small by pre-war standards, the Pip-Boy 2000 still retained some of the design flaws found in the Pip-Boy Model 1.0. It utilized more modern cathode ray tube monitors in green monochrome that provided a higher resolution display than the Pip-Boy 1.0, though it was still bulky and a little too cumbersome for many to fully adopt. It would be the Pip-Boy 2000 that initially gained the interest of Vault-Tec and Bud Askins, with their contract with Robco leading to all Vault-Tec staff and established certain vaults being supplied this model. This is the model used by the famous Vault 13 Dweller, known by many as simply the Vault Dweller, in his quest to retrieve a water chip for Vault 13 and later to defeat the Super Mutant Master during the events of the first Fallout game. The Vault Dweller's Pip-Boy would also provide vital aid to the grandson of the Vault Dweller and protagonist of Fallout 2, the Chosen One, many years later, when he ventured out into the wasteland in a mission to find a Garden of Eden creation kit that would restore life to his village, though his journey would pit him against the remnants of the pre-war American government, now known as the Enclave. Its global position system was so advanced that it automatically generated maps of its users' local area, allowing for safe traversal and backlogs that made venturing back into those areas so much safer. The Pip-Boy Model 2000 could also record audio and video, which was able to be shared with other Pip-Boys or transferred to computer systems. It made keeping track of its users' chores and job assignments far easier, even allowing for important important dates and events to be marked on its calendar. The Pip-Boy 2000 even had an alarm clock, which saved users from having to carry around a bulky corded alarm clock that would have had to be continuously reset after use. As an optional feature to the Pip-Boy 2000, the Pip-Boy could be upgraded with a Watts CU motion sensor, which would detect the movement of biological material over a distance using a tuned radar device, very similar to a real-world speed awareness monitor that detects vehicle traffic speeds and displays it on a screen. This upgrade would allow for the maps generated by the Pip-Boy 2000 to mark the location of all living things on the map as a red dot. This upgrade would have been fairly common, as it can be found all over the new California wasteland in 2016-1. When obtained, it provides a 20% bonus to the Outdoorsman skill buff, so obtaining it during the campaign of the first two Fallout games is that much more worth it. The Pip-Boy's holodisk reader could be used to read any holotape that the user desired. The Pip-Boy 2000 also has a special screen that contains the owner's Vault-Tec personnel record, which serves as a database for all the user's abilities, including attributes, derived statistics, skills, traits, and the Pip-Boy system will analyze and catalog sustained currently. This would have greatly aided pre-war corporations in knowing the full capabilities of their staff with a simple transfer of data. But inside the vaults, such data would have been vital in deciding who is fit for what career, possibly even working alongside the GOAT test to aid the dwellers in filling whatever role they would best be suited for. Its subroutines also allows the owner to keep track of their standings with local factions, perhaps used pre-war to access job performance. Now it provides the vital role in knowing just what faction could be relied on by the users, so they won't mistake friend for foe. Curiously enough, it keeps track of the number of creatures and characters that their users have slain. Perhaps this was intended for something else pre-war, maybe even military service. Now it's adapted to the much more gruesome role of kill counter. Having a Pip-Boy also provided access to other technologies as well, including Pip-Boy answer consoles that would be required to take certain standardized tests transmitted to the Pip-Boy through a localized system. The Pip-Boy's recording systems would automatically translate all conversational data into text, allowing for users to review conversations and analyze what they should say next. It even aided users during trades, providing a comprehensive trading menu. An upgrade for the Pip-Boy that would greatly aid the user would be a memory enhancer, which transmitted information in the form of an optic flash directly to the user's brain, including dictionaries, encyclopedias, languages, and medical data. With all their functionality, they're not the most durable, as their systems required a routine of constant maintenance, or their users would find their data corrupted, and the machine would lose all functionality. Rob Coe, thinking ahead, would issue all Pip-Boys 2000s with a 3-month warranty plan. All Vault dwellers would have to register for a Pip-Boy to prove that they would handle its technology. The process to qualify would require dwellers to participate in an orientation seminar given by none other than their Vault's overseer to explain the functions, users, personal information settings, and maintenance information. To prevent the Pip-Boy from sliding and chafing on the user's wrist, they would be measured so that the machine could be adjusted to secure it comfortably. This Pip-Boy also holds one of the few instances of Robco's Pip-Boy corporate mascot, also known as Vault Boy 2000, not to be confused with everyone's favorite yellow-haired Vault suit-donning mascot Vault Boy, who is Vault-Tech's mascot. Robco's mascot has pointy ears, red hair, and wears a red and yellow jumpsuit. The 2000 was also seen in Fallout Tactics, and intended for use in J.E. Sawyer's unfinished Simple RPG. There, the basic model could be modified with expansion hardware. Advanced, jam-packed vacuum tubes called data tubes could be connected to expansion slots to improve the device's functionality. The number of slots depended on the model. The 2000 handheld would have 6, while the wrist-mounted model could only take 4, which in of itself was probably one of the first retcons that the Pip-Boy 2000 was handheld, despite being firmly established that the model was wrist-mounted. There was even a Brotherhood-made version out in the Midwest, utilized by the Midwestern Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood are no stranger to collecting and creating technology, but the creation of the Pip-Boy 2000 Brotherhood Edition might be one of their most impressive feats, if not for the countless other things they've both collected, invented, and destroyed in their centuries-long cycle of expansion and decay across the United States. Imagine a Brotherhood Elder or Paladin with a Pip-Boy. They just might stand a chance against any one of the protagonists. Although it was not as advanced as later models, it's still sought after in the Wasteland for its functionality. Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI. Let's start with the model that sets the tone for Fallout 76, and honestly, for how organized Vault-Tec wanted the early post post-war world to feel. The Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI is a pre-war Pip-Boy model manufactured by Robco, and it's explicitly described as a database for the wearer's personal information and inventory, and an updated version of the Pip-Boy 2000. That part alone is huge, because it tells you this isn't some jury-rigged wasteland device. This is corporate hardware, refined over iterations, meant to be strapped onto people before the bombs fell. Here's the part that makes the Mark VI feel like Vault-Tec's mission control device. The lore says that each Vault dweller leaving Vault 76 was issued a Mark VI to assist in their goal of rebuilding Appalachia 25 years after the Great War. That is such a loaded sentence, because issued is not you found it. Issued means we planned for you to have this. It's the difference between a scavenger's tool and a company's expectation. Vault-Tec basically handed you a wearable to do post-apocalypse project management. And the Mark VI is not subtle about what it prioritizes. It's capable of tracking the wearer's status, tracking active or completed quests, organizing inventory, and it even has an overlay mode. In Fallout 76 gameplay terms, sure, that's your quests and your UI. But in lore terms, it's Vault-Tec telling you your life is a checklist now. You are not simply surviving. You are completing objectives. And I know that sounds dramatic, but come on, this is Vault-Tec. If they could have put a performance review into the Pip-Boy, they would have. The Mark VI also includes a Geiger counter and a holotape player beneath the display, and that combination is the most Fallout thing imaginable. On one hand, it's your radiation warning, your literal "do not step there or your organs will become soup" alarm. On the other hand, it's entertainment and information storage, which means even at the end of the world, Robco and Vault-Tec were still like, yes, existential terror, but also please enjoy your audio content. It's like the apocalypse came with a built-in podcast app, except the ads are propaganda and the host is a pre-war executive telling you to die with dignity. Now hold on for a second, because you might think the Mark VI is just the Fallout 76 Pip-Boy. No, it's actually a clue about Vault 76 itself. Vault 76 is framed as a reclamation vault. The people who leave are supposed to rebuild, coordinate, and stabilize. So the Pip-Boy they're issued is basically a field operations computer. It keeps you organized, it keeps you mission-focused, and it keeps you quantifying your own condition constantly. That's not just convenience. That's behavior shaping. Because when your device constantly shows you bars and percentages and tracked objectives, you start thinking in bars and percentages and tracked objectives. And the menu structure reinforces that. The Mark VI has 4 primary sections on its main display: stats, item, data, and radio. That's a simple list, but it tells you exactly how Robco expects you to live. Your body, your possessions, your information, your signals. That's it. That's the whole world. Everything else is noise. So when you step out into Appalachia and see a ruined house or a corpse or a strange new threat, the Pip-Boy is quietly translating reality into categories that make sense to a computer, which is helpful until it isn't, because the Mark VI stats section is not just vibes. It's explicitly an overview of health and capabilities, showing things like HP, level, and limb status, with the Vault-Boy animation changing depending on crippled limbs. And this is where the Pip-Boy becomes psychologically nasty. If you're hurt, the device doesn't just tell you you're hurt. It turns your pain into a cute animation. It turns injury into an icon, which is funny when you're playing. But in universe, that means a resident is conditioned to treat their body like an interface. You are literally looking at yourself the way a corporation would. The TM section does the same thing with everything you own, tracking carry weight, item value, ammo, armor, and more. Again, useful. Also, a little dystopian. Imagine living in the wasteland and your first instinct is not, do I need this, but what is the stack weight and cap value? That is not a natural human thought. That is a Pip-Boy thought. Robco put a store inside your arm. If the bombs never dropped, Robco would have absolutely added a 5th tab called Subscriptions. You'd open it, and it would say, your hydration tracking trial has ended. Pay $9.99 a month or dehydrate manually. We even know from the Burning Springs update in 76 that the 2000 Mark VI had its own blinged-out counterpart known as the Pimp-Boy 2000 Mark VI. Make of that what you will. Anyway, now here's the big pivot. The Mark VI is an updated Pip-Boy 2000 line device, issued to Vault 76 dwellers for a structured mission of rebuilding not just Appalachia, but the whole of America, which is limited to Appalachia. That's one philosophy. But Fallout 4's Pip-Boy model is a different kind of terrifying, because it's tied to a cluster of vaults where the experiments were all different, but the infrastructure was shared. Pip-Boy 3000. The Pip-Boy 3000 is probably the one that most of you were introduced to in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. The couriers provided him the much-needed mapping data to journey forth in his mission to decide the fate of the Mojave Wasteland. His Pip-Boy 3000 even made it possible for him to travel to score a position in the Happy Trails Caravan Company and travel to the Zion National Park in Utah, not to mention earning the disdain of the Robco-hating Dr. O, or Zero in Big Mountain, or the equal dislikes from former Brotherhood Elder Elijah at the Sierra Sierra Madre. Plus, it came in handy with the challenges they faced traveling through the Lonesome Road on their way to confront Ulysses. The lone wanderer of Vault 101 would be aided greatly by his Pip-Boy 3000 to track his father down, destroy the Enclave, and complete Project Purity, which would deliver pure drinkable water to the capital wasteland. The Pip-Boy 3000 Model A would be released shortly after the Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI, improving upon its design in many ways. The Vault Tech deal enabled Robco to produce these on a much greater scale, able to stock the vaults that were lucky enough to be built after their release with a much greater number of Pip-Boys in their storage. As many of the vaults in the new California region had been built before its release, the Pip-Boy 3000 model would never reach those vaults and mostly be distributed to the residents' vault dwellers in both in the American Southwest and on the East Coast. Those vaults would have such an overabundance of these many that vaults would still be distributing mine-conditioned Pip-Boy 3000 models as far as 200 years after the Great War. It featured much of the same technology displayed in the Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI, though the range of these technologies would prove to extend greater than the Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI. This model sported an improved version of the Geiger counter, which was much more efficient and could detect radiation far more acutely than the Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI. Its health technology systems were far more accurate, capable of quickly toggling stimpaks and RadAway. It could detect the status of limbs, number of stimpaks that the user has, and assist in guided applications of stimpaks so that they could be applied directly crippled areas or to the body as a whole, which utilized vital areas to heal wounds alongside other health issues, something that the Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI could only choose one or the other. Like other models, it also utilized auto-mapping data and could detect biosignatures through those systems, though with the Pip-Boy 3000, it could map out a much greater range and access locational data that would help its users through a more comprehensive mapping system. The Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI's mapping system had an overlapping issue, while the Pip-Boy 3000's mapping allowed for users to know just where they're walking without getting routes mixed up with one another. The Pip-Boy 3000 was a commercial success amongst the more wealthy Americans, as Robco provided consumers with the option to customize its exterior shell with gold and silver plating and encrusted diamonds. This would distinguish users from the common Pip-Boy Mark VI owner, as these materials would have inflated the cost beyond the means of even the most wealthy of Americans. This model would be labeled at the Pip-Boy 3 billion, and the courier has the option to obtain one if they assist Mick, who can be found at Mick and Ralph's store in Freeside, as part of an unmarked quest to figure out why the Omertas, who oversee the Gomorrah Casino, have suddenly stopped purchasing munitions from Mick. All the courier has to do to start this quest is talk to Mick and ask them about their business. Who will mention the Omertas and ask the courier to find out why and hand him a note to remind him to figure out Mick's situation. This questline will be blocked if the courier has already completed How Little We Know, the Omerta's faction quest. So be sure to wait until after to do that questline and side with the Omerta bosses, Nero, and Big Sal. Any other option, and Big Sal will not be around for the courier to convince him to continue doing business with Mick, which will take a speech check of 50. From there, all you will have to do is return to Mick and say, "Good news. The Omertas say they'll buy arms from you again." Mick will show his gratitude and reward the courier with the Pip-Boy 3 billion. The courier's Pip-Boy 3000 will be replaced by Pip-Boy 3 billion, but can be switched back to the original Pip-Boy 3000 at any time. All they'll have to do is talk to Mick, who will give the option. Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV. The Mark IV is described as a pre-war personal information processor manufactured by Robco, again acting as a database for personal information and inventory, and it's an updated version of the Pip-Boy 3000. That sounds similar, but watch what changes when we get into distribution. The Mark IV was distributed to 6 Vault Tech vaults in the vicinity of Boston: Vault 75, Vault 81, Vault 95, Vault 111, Vault 88, and Vault 114. That is a localized rollout, a regional tech standard, which means Vault Tech was coordinating hardware across multiple vault projects in one metro area, likely because they wanted the same baseline of control and access, and the Mark IV's functions are spelled out with way more "this is a serious piece of equipment" detail. It has a built-in Geiger counter. It displays stats, maps, inventory, and item properties. Its screen acts as a flashlight in low visibility areas, and it has a dial for tuning radio frequencies. That last part matters. The Mark VI has a radio too, but in Fallout 4, the radio is not just entertainment. It's an intelligence channel. It's how you hear distress calls, propaganda, warnings, recruitment signals, and weird, creepy broadcasts that make you go, "I should not have tuned into this?" Keep that in mind, because this is where the Pip-Boy stops being helpful and starts being holy relic. The Mark IV is not only a survival interface. It's a system that's complex enough that the operating menu even lists a software stack, memory, and multitasking behavior. That means, in the universe, this thing is running like a real computer, not some magical handwave device. It boots. It has an operating system. It has constraints. And those constraints tell you what kind of machine it is. The Mark IV runs pip OSV 7.1.0.8 and uses a monochromatic vector display. And one of the listed details is that it has 64 kilobytes of onboard memory, with a specific amount free after initialization. Now, on the surface, that's nerd trivia. But in universe, it suggests the Pip-Boy is designed like older clunky tech, but optimized to do a bunch of tasks at once, because the Mark IV's OS supports some form of multitasking. The lore explicitly notes that health notifications, munitions monitoring, quest tracking, and audio playback can run concurrently. That is huge. It means the Pip-Boy is not just a static logbook. It's actively monitoring your condition and your environment while you do other things. And then it gets even more important for a Fallout 4 era protagonist. The Mark IV integrates with Power Armor computers, allowing access to the Pip-Boy from within the armor through a HUD, like on visor display. That's not just convenient. That means Robco and the broader pre-war tech ecosystem were designing interoperability. Your wearable computer plugs into your walking tank suit and keeps the same interface, which is exactly how a military contractor thinks. Seamless, standardized, efficient. And if you're a cynic, it also means you never stop being tracked, even when you climb into a sealed armored shell. Also, the Mark IV is described as being more ergonomically designed than earlier Pip-Boy 3000 models, with the note that earlier designs had inconvenient control placement and that this was fixed on the Mark IV. That sounds like a minor thing, but it implies a timeline of product feedback and refinement before the Great War. People used these. People complained. Robco improved them. The apocalypse didn't interrupt a single moment of version update culture. It just froze it mid-rollout. Now, here's the angle that I think makes the Mark IV feel different from the Mark VI. The Mark VI is a vault exit tool for a planned rebuilding mission. The Mark IV is a vault infrastructure tool distributed across multiple vaults in one region, including vaults with wildly different purposes. So the Mark IV isn't tailored for one mission. It's a universal key to living inside Vault Tech's ecosystem. It's the same baseline device whether you're in a vault meant for experimentation on children, a vault meant for social tests, a vault meant for cryogenic nonsense, or a vault that is literally built into a corporate theme park. The hardware stays consistent. The suffering changes. And the Mark IV has one other detail that's easy to miss if you only think of it as the Fallout 4 menu. The General Pip-Boy article notes that the Mark IV used a revamped display interface with animated images, could play games like Atomic Command and Red Menace, and unlike predecessors, could manually unlock main vault door entrances. That is insane in universe. That means some Pip-Boy models are not just personal devices. They are access devices. They are authorization tools. They are literally tied to vault security infrastructure. So when you see a Pip-Boy on someone's arm, you're not just seeing their journal. You might be seeing a key. That also goes for the Pip-Boys you see throughout Vault 81, and can even give random wastelanders in Vault 88. They're devices made to monitor, but can easily be removed if need be. And that's where the Pip-Boy becomes the quiet backbone of Vault Tech control. You don't need a guard at every door if the door recognizes the device. You don't need constant oversight if the device structures the user's life. You don't even need to convince people they're being managed, because the interface makes it feel normal. That's why the Pip-Boy is one of Fallout's best pieces of world building. It's a cute retro computer. It's also a corporate collar. Let's compare the Mark VI and the Mark IV in plain human terms. Both are pre-war Robco devices designed as databases for personal information and inventory. Both have Geiger counters. Both organize your life into tabs. But the Mark VI is framed around helping Vault 76 dwellers rebuild Appalachia, with explicit quest tracking as a core capability. The Mark IV is framed around being the standardized Boston Vault model, with detailed OS behavior, multitasking, and integration with Power Armor systems. One is a structured mission device. The other is a mature platform device that feels like it was meant to be the backbone of a whole Vault region's daily operations. Pip-Boy 3000 Mark V. Let's talk about the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark V, because this is the one tied to the Fallout TV series, and it's basically a walking proof that the Pip-Boy line didn't just exist as one static device. It evolved. The Mark V is described as a pre-war Pip-Boy device that appears in the Fallout TV series. Created by Robco and worn on the left forearm, predominantly used by Vault inhabitants to assist with Vault utilities. It receives distributed notifications and can allow access to living quarters. That sentence is doing so much heavy lifting because it quietly reframes the Pip-Boy from personal computer into part of the Vault's internal operating system. It's not just your device, it's your login. And the Mark V's distribution is one of the most interesting lore tells we've gotten in a while, because the lore calls out that this version was distributed to at least 4 known vaults in California California, Vault 4, Vault 31, Vault 32, and Vault 33. It was also used by certain Vault Tech employees in the pre-war era and scientists in the post-war enclave. So yeah, this isn't just a Vault resident toy. This is a device that moves between classes of people: regular dwellers, corporate employees, and the people who think the enclave is a good idea, which already tells you the hardware is doing something serious. Here's the thing, because I know what you're thinking. Okay, it's a newer model with some nice UI. So what? No, the Mark V is the most obviously modern Pip-Boy in terms of how it behaves like a connected device. The interface shares its user interface with the Pip-Boy 2000 Mark VI and the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV, and it can play minigames like Atomic Command, meaning the software language is consistent across models. That's a platform. That's not a single gadget. It's like Robco built an operating environment and then kept shipping compatible hardware shells for it. Now look at the physical interaction. The Mark V is controlled by knobs on both sides, with one knob switching menus and the other navigating within them. That seems small until you realize what it implies in universe. This isn't a random bespoke one-off. It's designed to be operated quickly, almost like it expects you to be multitasking, moving, stressed, wearing gloves, maybe doing something dangerous. And then there's the drop of one of the most Fallout details imaginable. The Mark V has a built-in Geiger counter just like the Mark IV and Mark VI. So it's still a survival tool, but it also has a built-in microphone with a pickup range of a small room, and there's an explicit note of a security flaw where a third party can bug the device and eavesdrop on conversations near the wearer. That is not a fun extra feature. That is, your wrist computer can become a wiretap. If you ever wanted a single line that sums up the Fallout world, it's that. A device that claims to keep you safe also makes you vulnerable in a completely different way. Quick joke, because the only way to cope with microphone wrist surveillance is to laugh. Imagine being a Vault resident trying to gossip, and your friend goes, "Shh, don't say that out loud, my Pip-Boy might be subscribed to the Vault's premium eavesdrop plan." Anyway, the Mark V's menus also show you how Vault Tech wanted the device to structure your life. It has 5 distinct menus: Stat, INV, Data, MAPI, and Radio. That's the classic Pip-Boy brain layout. Your body, your stuff, your information, your location, your signals. But the Mark V adds this extra layer of Vault as a network. In the Stat menu, messages and alerts can show up as distributed notifications, displayed in large text, often with images related to the message. That means the Pip-Boy is not just reading the world. The world, or at least the Vault system, is pushing information to you. This is basically a Vault-wide notification feed, like a pre-war corporate intranet, except your intranet is telling you about breaches and marriage approvals. And the Map menu is where the Mark V starts looking less like a journal, and more like a tracking and navigation device you'd give to field personnel. The Mark V stores navigational and geographic information, can calculate the shortest route to waypoints, and it updates the current position of tracked objects every second. It can also accept latitude and longitude coordinates as waypoints. And then it gets even more explicit. It has a built-in tracking module that can be removed and attached to an object. And then that object is marked on your navigation display with the selectable icon. That is the "where did my stuff go" feature. Sure, but in a Fallout context, it's also the "where did you go" feature if somebody slaps that module onto you, your bag, your weapon crate, or the person you're escorting. This is the point where I need to look you in the eyes and say it. The Mark V is arguably the most Vault Tech friendly Pip-Boy we've discussed, because it's built to make Vault life and Vault control easier. Its notifications, navigation, object tracking, and audio, all tied into a device worn by everyone important. The Mark IV already functions as a Vault key with its adapter plug, opening Vault doors, and even interfacing with robots under certain conditions. The Mark V doubles down by emphasizing alerts, tracking, and connectivity. And yes, the Mark V also has an adapter plug feature similar to the Mark IV. The Mark V descriptions call out an adapter plug that can be plugged into ports around the Vault, commonly used to open and close interior Vault doors and the exterior gear-shaped blast doors. So the Mark V is also literally part of Vault infrastructure. It isn't just something you wear, it's part of what makes the Vault function. The Mark V was so advanced that Robert House, owner and founder of Robco, would use it as part of his ultimate contingency plan for if his physical body were to fail him. This contingency was thought a failure by House during the events of Fallout New Vegas, until everyone's favorite gunslinging ghoul, Cooper Howard, was able to deliver the diode into his cold fusion reactor at the culmination of Season 2 of the Fallout Amazon series. This contingency plan consisted of giving a special Mark V, capable of containing a fully uploaded copy of Robert House's mind within it, to a trusted advisor. Knowing that House had viewed Benny as a sort of protege, perhaps if he hadn't betrayed this, would have ended up in the hands of Benny. Instead, it would be given to Cooper Howard, though this would prove a fatal miscalculation, as it had a fairly short range, and when the ghoul abandoned the Mark V Pip-Boy deep underground, House would be unable to reconnect to his main systems and seize command over whatever remained of his systems. Next up, the developers of Van Buren reimagined the Pip-Boy, thinking about what it could have become if the series took different turns. And it brings us what Robco's product line might have looked like if the Great War and Interplay's bankruptcy hadn't hit the brakes on everything. Lil Pip 3000. This is based on Van Buren design documents and is not canon. Van Buren was the cancelled Fallout 3 by Black Isle Studios, and the Lil Pip 3000 was going to be the main Pip-Boy variant there, and it was technically the first Pip-Boy meant to be visibly worn on the player. Already, that's a big deal, because it's a design philosophy shift. Instead of the Pip-Boy being purely a UI abstraction, it becomes a physical object that is part of the character's silhouette, like a real wearable people notice and recognize. Now, the really fun part is what it implies about tech evolution inside Fallout. The Lil Pip is described as a much less cumbersome device worn on the forearm, offering all the functionality of its bigger variant. It used integrated circuits instead of vacuum tubes, had a flip-up split-screen monitor, and let you pick between 3 display colors: green, blue, and red. It could accept up to 6 data tubes as expansion hardware to expand functionality. It could read holodisks using a loading tray, and it wasn't a sales success, largely because it was fragile compared to the rugged 2000 series. That's a whole alternate tech history in one paragraph. Integrated circuits implies miniaturization. Flip-up split screen implies a more modern interface mindset. Expansion tubes implies modular computing. But fragility implies the trade-off. You make it smaller and sleeker, you lose the "this will survive the apocalypse" ruggedness that makes other Pip-Boys legendary. In other words, the Lil Pip 3000 feels like Robco trying to go from industrial vault hardware to consumer wearable, and then finding out that consumer wearables break when you drop them, which is a lesson humanity apparently needs to learn every 10 years. Here's a quick joke before we keep going. The Lil Pip 3000 is basically the Fallout universe inventing the first smartwatch, then immediately discovering the first smartwatch problem, which is that if you sneeze on it wrong, it shatters and costs a month's salary to replace. And the Lil Pip's interface is also telling. When open, it showed date and time with a displayed time zone, listed expansion hardware present, and allowed access to 4 main functions: alarm, tasks, maps, and downloads. That menu set is way more daily life organizer than combat survival interface. Compare that to stat, INV, data, map, radio. The Lil Pip is not obsessed with inventory the same way, at least in the way it presents itself. It's framed like a personal assistant. That's huge for tone. It suggests a Fallout world where Pip-Boys weren't just issued to vault residents as control devices, but were potentially trending toward being normal tech products people might buy, upgrade, and customize. Now, because it's non-canon, you don't treat this like hard lore for the modern games, but you absolutely treat it like a window into what the franchise creators imagined about the Pip-Boys' design future, especially because it was later included in a tabletop RPG description by Joshua Sawyer, reinforcing that it was a real concept with thought behind it. Hold on to your hats, because we're about to go even weirder. You might think the non-canon Pip-Boy stuff ends at smaller wrist device, but then you hit the PIP pad, and suddenly the Pip-Boy concept stops being a wrist gadget at all. It becomes a tablet, and if you've ever wondered what Fallout would look like if Robco leaned into a full product ecosystem, the PIP pad is basically that hint.pip pad. So, much like the previous one, this is also based on stuff that never came out, specifically Project V13 promotional material, and is not canon. But the description is clear and consistent. The Robco PIP pad is an experimental tablet-sized electronic device manufactured by Robco as an offshoot of the Pip-Boy series, mainly for reading text and running high-resolution graphics. A cache of these devices was discovered after the Great War in an old Robco warehouse. There are known bugs with the text processor, and users may occasionally see strange characters. I love this because it's the most believable piece of lost pre-war tech writing ever. Of course, there was a warehouse full of tablets. And of course, they were experimental. Oh, and how could we forget, of course, the text software was buggy. Fallout is retrofuturism, but it's also a world where corporate tech was always a little janky, always oversold, always shipped with issues, and then the apocalypse happened and nobody was around to patch version 1.0. The PIP pad also ties into Fallout's meta history, because the page says the Armageddon Rag magazine started issuing electronic versions readable by PIP pads with its 3rd issue, and that the PIP pad is the interface of the Armageddon Rag Project Vi 13 newsletter. That's a real piece of franchise promotional weirdness, but it also reinforces the idea that the PIP, the personal information processor, as a category could have been a whole line of devices, not just a Pip-Boy. The Pip-Boy models map directly onto Fallout's big question about pre-war America, not simply the question of did they have cool technology. We already know that they did. The question is, what was the technology for? The Pip-Boy can act as a vault key and interface with other systems like Power Armor, which tells you the device is infrastructure, not a toy. The future models, the Mark IV, 5, and 6, get even more explicit about infrastructure by emphasizing distributed alerts, vault utility access, object tracking updates every second, and a microphone that can be exploited, which is basically the nightmare combo of convenience and surveillance. The Lil Pip and PIP pad show you the consumer future Robco might have chased, where PIP devices become normal tech, and that's arguably the darkest timeline because it means vault tech style control becomes socially normalized long before anyone steps into a vault. Each one is basically a time capsule, not just for the tech, for the mindset, because each model quietly reveals what vault tech thought you were going to be doing when you walked out of that vault door: surviving, rebuilding, being monitored, or my favorite option, being turned into a human spreadsheet with legs. And the reason all of this is so fun is because every model answers the same question in a different way. When you strap a Pip-Boy on, are you putting on a survival tool, or are you putting on a corporate interface that turns your life into data? In Fallout, the honest answer is usually both, and that's exactly why it's one of the smartest and creepiest objects the franchise ever invented. This has been every Fallout Pip-Boy explained. On October 23, 2077, the world ended in 2 hours, and while we have been exploring vaults and their twisted experiments, 50 states got nuked, irradiated, and left to rot. So with that cheerful note out of the way, let's see what happened to every state in Fallout. Alaska, the first war. Let's start with the state that literally caused the apocalypse. Yeah, you heard that right. Alaska didn't just get nuked on October 23rd, it spent 11 years as an active war zone before that. In 2066, China invaded across the Bering Strait because they were desperate for oil. The Battle of Anchorage was absolutely insane. Imagine trench warfare, but it's negative 40 degrees, and both sides are fighting over frozen oil fields that probably weren't even worth it anymore. General Jingwei and his Chinese forces carved through American defenses for years. The US got pushed back so hard they had to invent power armor just to have a fighting chance. Think about that for a second. America was losing so badly in Alaska that they had to revolutionize military technology just to break even. The T-51 power armor wasn't developed because someone had a cool idea. It was developed because without it, China was going to control all of North America's remaining oil reserves. By January 2077, just 9 months before the bombs fell, Anchorage was finally liberated. The propaganda posters went up. America celebrated. Great job, everyone. Really worth it. Because when the Great War hit in October, Alaska took nuclear strikes from both Chinese and American missiles. The irony is almost poetic. The state that started the resource war ended up so irradiated that whatever oil was left became completely inaccessible. But wait, it gets worse. Right after the bombs, temperatures dropped even harder as nuclear winter hit. The already frozen wasteland became a radioactive ice sheet where survival wasn't just unlikely, it was basically impossible. Anyone trying to set up camp in the ruins wasn't just fighting radiation and mutated wildlife. The cold could kill you in minutes. By 2188, over a century later, massive hordes of feral ghouls poured out of the Anchorage wasteland heading south. Locals called it the Anchorage Scourge, which is a pretty metal name for a zombie apocalypse within the apocalypse. These weren't just regular feral ghouls either. These were ghouls that had survived in one of the most hostile environments on Earth for over a century. Alaska didn't just die in the war, it became a contaminated graveyard that kept killing for generations. The state that America fought so hard to keep became the state that everyone else fought hard to avoid. And the oil? Still there, still frozen, still radioactive, still completely worthless. Alaska fought an 11-year war and became a frozen graveyard nobody remembers. But one state didn't just survive. It actually rebuilt civilization, and that success might have been even more tragic. California, the Republic. California is the only state that didn't just survive, it actually tried to rebuild America. And honestly, that ambition might have been its biggest mistake. Look, California got absolutely hammered during the Great War. Los Angeles took multiple direct hits, creating the Boneyard. San Francisco got hit so hard that parts of the city sank into the bay. San Diego's naval base was a priority target that got vaporized. The state's major population centers were devastated. But here's the difference. California had vaults that actually worked as intended, or at least East, close enough. Vault 15 gave birth to Shady Sands in 2142. Vault 8 became Vault City. Vault 13 produced the Vault Dweller who saved the region from the Master's super mutant army. These weren't just settlements scraping by on irradiated squirrel meat. They were the seeds of actual civilization. By 2189, the new California Republic was born from Shady Sands. Democracy, rule of law, actual infrastructure. It was basically the only place in post-war America that remembered what the government was supposed to look like. Not raiders with delusions of grandeur, not tech-hoarding isolationists, but actual representative democracy. The NCR expanded rapidly, north into Oregon, east toward Nevada, south into Baja. By 2281, the NCR controlled more territory than any other faction in North America, over 700,000 people. That's actual civilization numbers. They had an army, a currency backed by gold, trade routes, agriculture, and industry. They had corruption and bureaucracy, which weirdly enough was kind of reassuring because it meant they'd rebuilt enough of pre-war America to include all the annoying parts too. So naturally, they screwed it up. Success breeds problems, and the NCR had all of them. They spread themselves way too thin fighting wars on multiple fronts. The Brotherhood War drained massive resources. The Mojave Campaign turned into a meat grinder at Hoover Dam against Caesar's Legion, a faction that treated slavery and crucifixion as legitimate government policy. Internally, the NCR struggled with overextension. Supply lines stretched too far. Communication broke down. Brahmin barons wielded disproportionate political power. Corruption crept into every level of bureaucracy. The NCR was becoming the pre-war America it was trying to rebuild, complete with all the problems that led to the Great War in the first place. And then there's Shady Sands. According to one timeline, the capital got destroyed sometime after 2277. The fall of Shady Sands, whether it was sabotage, war, or internal collapse, we don't have all the details, but the symbolism is brutal. The city that started the NCR, that proved civilization could return, was potentially destroyed while the Republic was busy fighting external wars. The NCR is proof that even when you do everything right, the wasteland finds a way to kick you in the teeth. California tried to save America, and America rewarded them by potentially blowing up their capital and exposing every flaw in their system. Yeah, that plan worked out really well for them. Democracy and expansion couldn't save California, but what about one genius with perfect planning and a pre-war defense grid? Turns out Nevada had both, and it still wasn't enough. Nevada, perfect planning Vegas, barely got hit, not through luck, but through the most elaborate defense system one man ever built. Mr. House, the pre-war genius who founded Robco Industries, saw the Great War coming years in advance. He spent enormous resources developing a laser defense grid around Las Vegas. When October 23rd came and Chinese missiles streaked across the sky, House's system activated. It worked, mostly. The defense grid shot down most of the warheads aimed at Vegas. The Strip itself survived mostly intact, a glittering oasis in a radioactive desert frozen in time like a pre-war museum that still had power. The catch? The system's activation fried parts of House's cryogenic life support. He fell into a coma that lasted longer than intended. House planned to wake up after a few years. Instead, he woke up in 2138, 60 years after the bombs fell. It wasn't until 2274 that he finally revealed himself, deploying his Securitron army to reclaim the Strip. All that planning, all that preparation, and he still ended up in the middle of someone else's war. But House is nothing if not adaptable. He reactivated the Securitron army. He rebuilt the three families from local tribals to run his casinos. He played the NCR and Legion against each other while maintaining Vegas's independence. The man spent 2 centuries in a coma and still managed to run circles around every other faction in the Mojave. The rest of Nevada wasn't so fortunate. Vault 22's spore carriers turned parts of Nevada into biological hazard zones where plants eat you instead of the other way around. The fungus puppeted corpses to spread more spores, walking mushroom zombies, because regular zombies weren't horrifying enough. Vault 11 tells maybe the darkest story in the entire Fallout franchise. Residents were told they had to sacrifice one person yearly, or the Vault's life support would kill everyone. So they held elections where the winner got executed. For years, they built an entire political system around ritual murder. By the time only 5 residents remained, they'd had enough. They marched into the sacrifice chamber together and told the AI they were done. And then the AI congratulated them. The Vault was never going to kill them. It was a test to see if they'd refuse to murder each other. They'd passed. After decades of unnecessary death, they'd passed a test they didn't know was a test. 4 of the 5 survivors immediately shot themselves. One walked out into the Mojave and was never seen again. Vault 11 is Here's proof that sometimes the cruelest experiments test whether humans will kill each other for no reason. And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. Vault 34 was stuffed with weapons instead of living space. The residents eventually revolted, the reactor got sabotaged, and radiation flooded the vault. Survivors became the Boomers, a heavily armed faction that shoots first and never bothers with questions. Nevada survived the initial blast better than almost anywhere in America, but between fungal zombies, political horror experiments, and reactor meltdowns, the aftermath tried its hardest to finish what the bombs started. And honestly, between House's autocracy, NCR's imperialism, and Caesar's slavery, I'm not sure any of the possible futures for Nevada were actually good. But if House proves that planning ahead doesn't guarantee survival, Massachusetts proves that being the smartest people in the room doesn't either. Massachusetts. Genius horror, Boston took a direct hit on October 23, 2077. The bomb created the glowing sea, a perpetually irradiated hellscape where radiation levels stayed lethal 2 centuries later. Even in full power armor with rad protection, the glowing sea tries to kill you. But the real story of Massachusetts isn't the bomb that destroyed the surface. It's what happened underground at MIT. The Institute, formerly MIT, saw the war coming. They built a massive underground facility beneath the campus, a self-contained research city isolated from the surface. When the bombs fell, they sealed themselves in and kept working. For 2 centuries, the Institute advanced technology in complete isolation. By 2287, they had synths, synthetic humans indistinguishable from real people. They had teleportation technology, they had molecular relays, advanced robotics. The Institute was, objectively, the most technologically advanced faction in post-war America. Pretty impressive, right? Wrong, because the Institute had a fundamental problem. They looked at the surface not as a community of survivors trying to rebuild, but as a laboratory full of test subjects. The Institute kidnapped people from surface settlements and replaced them with synth duplicates, sometimes for espionage, sometimes for experimentation, sometimes just to see if they could. They released super mutants to observe how settlements would respond. They sabotaged attempts at organized government because they viewed surface dwellers as too primitive. In 2229, the Commonwealth Provisional Government formed. For the first time since the bombs fell, Massachusetts was trying to unify under democratic rule. The Institute's response? The Institute Massacre. They killed the representatives, destroyed the attempt at government, and ensured the Commonwealth would remain fragmented. The Institute had all the technology needed to rebuild civilization, and chose instead to treat the wasteland like their personal petri dish. When your greatest achievement is creating synthetic humans, and your first instinct is to use them as infiltrators while murdering anyone trying to form legitimate government, maybe reconsider your entire philosophy. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth fractured into isolated settlements. Diamond City became the largest settlement, but even it struggled with synth paranoia. Goodneighbor became a haven for drifters and criminals. Countless small settlements barely survived between super mutant attacks, raider raids, and the ever-present fear that your neighbor might be a synth. For decades, the Institute kidnapped surface dwellers and subjected them to FEV exposure, creating super mutants that were then released back to the surface. Imagine getting kidnapped by underground scientists, transformed into a monster, and dumped back in the wasteland with no memory of who you were. By 2287, Massachusetts was a 4-way Cold War between the Institute underground, the Brotherhood of Steel arriving in their giant airship, the railroad protecting synth refugees, and the Minutemen held together by one persuasive general. The fate of the entire Commonwealth hinged on which faction won, and honestly, none of the outcomes looked particularly great for anyone who just wanted to farm tomatoes in peace. Massachusetts proves that intelligence and technology mean nothing without wisdom and empathy. The Institute had the tools to save the Commonwealth, and chose, instead, to treat it like an experiment. They were the smartest people in the room, and the cruelest, which is its own special kind of tragedy. Massachusetts had underground scientists treating the surface like a laboratory, but at least they had factions trying to rebuild something. The Capital Wasteland didn't even get that mercy, and 200 years later, it still hasn't recovered. Capital Wasteland, America's graveyard. The Capital Wasteland, covering Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., is hands down the worst place in post-war America. Everywhere got nuked. Everywhere suffered. But the Capital Wasteland got special attention because the Chinese wanted to decapitate American leadership. Washington, D.C. took multiple direct strikes from high-yield warheads. The White House, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, all priority targets that got hit with everything China had. China threw everything at D.C. because if you're starting World War III, you kill the leadership first. Maryland and Virginia caught all the fallout and overflow strikes. Baltimore's ports got hit. Naval Station Norfolk got vaporized. The surrounding areas took enough radiation that 200 years later, the groundwater is still toxic enough to cause mutations. Here's the crazy part. 200 years after the bombs fell, the Capital Wasteland was still a radioactive hellhole. Everywhere else, at least, tried to recover. California built the NCR. Vegas got rebuilt by House. Even the Midwest established trade routes. worlds. The Capital Wasteland said no thanks and stayed absolutely miserable. Super mutants from Vault 87 hunted humans throughout the region. These weren't intelligent super mutants. These were rushed FEV experiments gone wrong, mentally damaged and pissed off. They captured humans for conversion or food. Downtown DC became super mutant territory where humans only went if they were suicidal or Brotherhood of Steel. Raiders controlled the ruins like packs of feral dogs. Talon Company, regulators, and countless other mercenary groups turned the wasteland into a war zone where trust was a death sentence. And then the Enclave emerged from Raven Rock, bringing with them the worst of pre-war America's ideology. The Enclave decided that everyone exposed to radiation was genetically impure and needed to be exterminated. Their solution? Modified FEV in the water supply that would kill anyone with radiation-induced mutations, which was basically everyone. Genocide through plumbing, efficient, horrifying, and perfectly on-brand for the Enclave. The only thing keeping the region from total collapse was the Brotherhood of Steel. Elder Lions broke from the main Brotherhood's doctrine to actually help Wastelanders instead of just hoarding technology. The Brotherhood fought super mutants in DC. They protected trade caravans. They worked on Project Purity to clean the Potomac River. Project Purity represents everything beautiful and tragic about the Capital Wasteland. Dr. James and his team worked for decades on a system to purify the Potomac's irradiated water. Not for profit, not for power, just to give people clean water. When the project finally neared completion, it became a war zone. The Enclave tried to weaponize it. The Brotherhood fought to protect it. James sacrificed himself to keep it from Enclave control. The Capital Wasteland proves that sometimes the apocalypse picks a favorite target and never lets go. 200 years of continuous suffering, mutation, and violence. The Capital Wasteland stayed broken because it got hit too hard and had too much symbolic value to ignore. Everyone wanted to control DC, but nobody wanted to actually fix it. The Capital Wasteland stayed broken because everyone wanted to control it, but nobody wanted to fix it. Pennsylvania had the opposite problem. Everyone knew about the Pitt steel mills, but nobody wanted to talk about the cost of keeping them running. Pennsylvania, the Pitt Pittsburgh, or the Pit, as it's known post-war, represents everything wrong with industrial America amplified to nightmare levels. The city took nuclear hits during the Great War, but what really defined the Pit was something that kept burning long after the bombs. The steel mills never went out. When nuclear fire rained down on Pittsburgh's industrial heart, the mills were running at full capacity for the war effort. 200 years later, those mills are still burning, still pumping toxic smoke into the air, still irradiating everything in the region. The air in the Pit is thick with poison. Breathing the air slowly poisons you. Working in the mills accelerates the process dramatically, and yet people still work there because the Pit has something almost nowhere else in post-war America has: industrial production capacity. By 2277, the Pit had become a slave city under the control of Asher, a former Brotherhood paladin. Asher survived a Brotherhood expedition, took control of local raider gangs, and built an empire on one principle: the Pit's mills could manufacture steel, and steel meant weapons, and weapons meant power. But running pre-war mills in a radioactive hellhole requires workers, lots of workers. Workers who would inevitably get poisoned by the radiation. Asher's solution was slavery. Raiders captured Wastelanders and brought them to the Pit, where they were forced to work in the mills until the radiation transformed them into trogs. Trogs are what happens when human exposure to the Pit's unique cocktail of radiation and toxins reaches critical mass. You don't just become a ghoul, you become something worse. Your body mutates, your mind degrades, and you become a feral, cannibalistic thing. The workers know this is their fate. They work knowing that every day brings them closer to becoming monsters, and they can't escape. Here's the part that makes the Pit genuinely disturbing. Asher wasn't entirely wrong in his reasoning. The Pit's industrial capacity made it one of the few places in post-war America that could manufacture steel, ammunition, and weapons at pre-war quality. Every faction with ambitions of rebuilding needed what the Pit could produce. But production required workers, and workers required slavery. Nobody volunteers to die slowly. Asher argued that a few decades of slavery was justified if it meant restoring industrial civilization. It's the trolley problem written across an entire city. Free the slaves and lose the only functional steel mill, potentially dooming hope of rebuilding. Keep the slaves and condemn thousands to transformation into monsters. Pit doesn't ask if you're willing to make hard choices. It asks if you're willing to make choices where hard is a euphemism for horrific. The Pit is what happens when the apocalypse strips away any possibility of moral high ground. Every choice is terrible. Every outcome involves massive suffering. You can't fix the Pit without getting blood on your hands. The rest of Pennsylvania took confirmed nuclear strikes throughout the state. Philadelphia was almost certainly hit. Harrisburg, the state capital, was a strategic target. The eastern part of the state got carpeted with enough nuclear strikes that the whole region became a contaminated dead zone. Pennsylvania didn't survive the Great War. It just burned at different temperatures. The Pit burns hot and makes you work until you transform into a monster. The rest of Pennsylvania burned fast Midwest and left nothing but ghosts. Pitt proves that sometimes survival requires choices so horrific that you question whether survival is worth it. And if Pennsylvania shows what happens when morality becomes negotiable, the Midwest shows what happens when technology becomes religion. Midwest Brotherhood Territory. The Midwest Commonwealth covered Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. When the bombs fell, the Midwest suffered like everywhere else. Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, all took direct nuclear strikes. Industrial centers became craters. The Great Lakes became breeding grounds for mutations. But the Midwest had something other regions didn't: the Midwest Brotherhood of Steel. This was a Brotherhood expeditionary force that went rogue during a cross-country mission, establishing their own chapter with their own rules. The Midwest Brotherhood was different from the start. The West Coast Brotherhood hoarded tech like it was holy. The Capital Wasteland Brotherhood tried to help people but struggled with resources. The Midwest Brotherhood took a third path: aggressive expansion and pragmatic recruitment. They recruited tribals. They accepted ghouls and even super mutants. They used vehicles, aircraft, and technological advantages to carve out an empire across the Midwest. Chicago became their center of power. They weren't hiding from the wasteland. They were conquering it. But conquest requires constant expansion, and expansion requires resources. The Midwest Brotherhood's territory grew, but so did their needs. They demanded tribute from anyone under their protection. They forcibly conscripted new recruits. They seized technology from anyone who had it. The Brotherhood, that started as protectors, slowly became warlords extracting resources from the weak. St. Louis became a super mutant stronghold that the Brotherhood fought for years to contain. Detroit's automotive factories attracted scavengers and death in equal measure. The ruins held working manufacturing equipment, but radiation levels made salvage operations incredibly dangerous. The factories became haunted places where the promise of treasure lured people to their deaths. Minnesota and Wisconsin dealt with the added challenge of nuclear winter. The Midwest already had harsh winters before the war. After the bombs, temperatures dropped and stayed low for decades. Starvation, freezing, and desperate violence killed more people in the first few years than the bombs did. Kansas deserves special mention. The city of Gravestone worshipped an unexploded nuclear bomb. The crater worshippers believed the bomb was a god waiting to ascend them through nuclear fire. They protected it, prayed to it, and violently attacked anyone who tried to defuse it. Because when the apocalypse happens, some people respond by worshipping the thing that nearly killed them. Radioactive tornadoes became a regular weather phenomenon across the Plains states. These were actual tornadoes that picked up radioactive dust, creating mobile contamination zones that killed anything they touched. The Midwest didn't die quickly. It died screaming, slowly, while hoarding the technology that could have helped. The Brotherhood had the tools to rebuild. They chose conquest instead. 200 years later, the Midwest is a Brotherhood empire where technology flows up and protection trickles down. It's feudalism with laser rifles. The Midwest became a Brotherhood empire where technology meant power and power meant control. At least they documented what happened. The South died so thoroughly that even its death went mostly unrecorded, which might be the cruelest fate of all. The South, the vanishing Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and Florida made up the Gulf Commonwealth and the broader South. This region is the least documented area in all of Fallout lore, and that silence is more terrifying than any detailed horror story because it means almost nobody survived to document what happened. When the Brotherhood doesn't bother documenting a place, when trade routes avoid it completely, when maps just leave it blank, that tells you everything about how thoroughly a place died. The South didn't just get nuked, it vanished from history. What little we know is scattered and terrifying. The Beastmasters, a tribal faction, somehow tamed wasteland creatures across the Gulf region. Think about what that means. In a world with deathclaws that can shred power armor, with red scorpions the size of cars, someone figured out how to domesticate them. That's either brilliant or suicidally insane. Taming a deathclaw requires getting close to something that can kill you in seconds. The Beastmasters achieved it, creating a faction that controlled territories through sheer intimidation. Imagine raiders approaching a settlement ready to loot, only to find the settlers riding deathclaws. The conversation ends quickly. Louisiana's swamps became even more hostile after the war. The bayous were already dangerous before the bombs. Post-war, the humidity in swamp water became perfect for breeding mutations. The swamps consumed entire pre-war cities under radioactive muck. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, entire urban centers just disappeared into the wetlands. What emerged from those swamps didn't resemble anything that lived before the war. Stories from traders speak of radiation-mutated alligators large enough to swallow a person whole, swarms of insects that moved with coordinated intelligence, plants that grew fast enough to trap and consume prey. Mississippi and Alabama simply vanished from the record. No major cities are documented. No surviving factions, no trade routes. The region became a blank spot, where even 2 centuries later, nobody knows what happened. Did the bombs kill kill everyone? Did the population migrate? Did something worse than radiation kill what the bombs didn't? We don't know. The silence is absolute. Texas presented a special problem due to its sheer size and strategic importance. Houston's ports and oil refineries undoubtedly took multiple nuclear strikes. Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, all would have been targeted. But Texas is massive. Rural areas between the cities might have survived the immediate strikes. The question is, what happened to those survivors? Texas had a strong independent culture before the war. Post-war, that independence might have helped communities survive, or it might have prevented cooperation, leading to isolated communities dying alone. We don't know because nobody survived to document it. Florida became so irrelevant that Brotherhood records list it as literal fiction. I don't even know what that means. Did Florida get so thoroughly destroyed that records of its existence seem fake? Did everyone die and the region become so contaminated that even the Brotherhood refuses to acknowledge it? The fact that we don't know is somehow worse than any specific answer. The South represents something uniquely terrifying in the Fallout universe: complete absence. Other regions failed, and we know how. The South just vanished. 200 years of history erased. Millions of people gone without record. Whatever happened to the South was so complete that even the stories died. But not every region vanished into silence. Some adapted so well to the apocalypse that they barely noticed the difference, which is its own kind of horror. New York, Silent Tomb. New York City was the largest city in pre-war America, home to millions, the financial capital of the world. When the Great War came, China hit New York with everything they had. Manhattan took multiple direct strikes. The financial district, Times Square, the UN headquarters, all vaporized in the first minutes. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, all hit hard enough that survivors were rare and lucky. The city that never slept went silent in less than an hour. The subways became tombs. Millions took shelter underground when the air raid sirens sounded. They weren't safe. When the bombs hit, the tunnels became ovens, then coffins. Blast waves traveled through the tunnels, killing thousands instantly. Radiation seeped through ventilation shafts. Fires consumed oxygen. People who survived the initial strikes died slowly in the dark, waiting for rescue that never came. 200 years later, New York remains mostly undocumented. No major factions control it. No trade routes pass through it. The ruins are too dangerous, too irradiated, too structurally unstable. Buildings that survived the blast became death traps as centuries of decay made them liable to collapse. What little information exists comes from rare scavengers who entered and made it back out. They speak of feral ghouls in numbers that make DC look underpopulated. Entire city blocks claimed by ghoul colonies, super mutants occupying fortified positions, raiders fighting over territory barely worth controlling, and underneath it all, the subways, still filled with the dead, still radioactive, still silent. New York was too big, too populated, too important to ignore. China made sure it died, and died completely. The city that represented American achievement became the city that proved American vulnerability. Upstate New York fared slightly better. Rural communities managed to survive through isolation and agriculture, but without connection to the coast or other regions, they remained isolated settlements barely scraping by. New York proves that sometimes the biggest targets die the hardest and stay dead the longest. The city is a monument to what America lost, and nobody wants to visit monuments built from millions of corpses. West Virginia, Reclamation Day. West Virginia occupies a unique place in Fallout history as the only state where we know exactly what happened in the first decades after the bombs because Vault 76 was designed to document it. Vault 76 was a control vault, no experiments, built to celebrate America's tricentennial. It was supposed to open after 20 years, releasing residents to rebuild on Reclamation Day, 2102, and it did. The vault opened exactly on schedule. Residents emerged with optimism, training, and resources. They found hell. West Virginia had taken strategic nuclear strikes across the state. Charleston, Morgantown, Harper's Ferry, all targets. But the real problem wasn't the bombs. It was what came after. The scorched plague swept across Appalachia, transforming humans into crystalline zombies that spread infection through violence. The scorched weren't just mindless. They coordinated, used weapons, hunted systematically, and they were contagious. The Free States, a survivalist faction that had prepared for nuclear war, survived the initial strikes in bunkers. They emerged to fight the scorched and lost. Their paranoia and preparation meant nothing against a plague that turned your neighbors into weapons against you. By 2102, when Vault 76 opened, the Free States were extinct. The responders, pre-war emergency services personnel, tried maintaining order. They set up medical facilities, distributed supplies, and trained survivors. They documented everything. The Scorched killed them all. Their last messages are desperate pleas for help that never came. The Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter tried to contain the Scorched threat. They identified the source: scorch beasts, massive mutated bats emerging from fissures in the earth. The Brotherhood launched strikes to seal them. The Scorched overwhelmed them. By 2102, the Appalachian Brotherhood was gone. Vault 76 residents emerged into a region where every major faction had tried to save Appalachia, and died trying. The optimism of Reclamation Day met the reality of a dead region where the plague was still active, still spreading, still killing. The Vault dwellers had to succeed where everyone else failed. West Virginia is proof that even when you do everything right, prepare for every contingency, document everything, the wasteland can still kill you. The state became a testing ground for post-war survival, and every test subject before Vault 76 failed. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happened to every Fallout Vault, click on the video on the screen.